Dumbledore. Mr. Caro's terrified voice cut through the corridor. Finite incantatum. Scott's first instinct was to get to Tata, the house elf who'd been struck down by Petrificus Totalis. Lulu isn't going to let you take that one, someone shrieked. A familiar house elf, Lulu, had appeared between Tata and Mr. Caro, her palm held up to intercept whatever spell he was trying to cast. Scott, breathing hard from exhaustion, seized the opening. He flicked his wand and, though he was tired, his aim was true. The invisible figure under an invisibility cloak stiffened at his charm. Scott's shoulders sagged as he confirmed the spell had taken. He planted his hands on his knees and tried to catch his breath. "Are you all right, Mr. Trollope?" Lulu asked, worry painted across her face. "I'm fine. Just a bit tired," Scott panted. Lulu fumbled nervously. "Shall Lulu take you to the hospital?" she asked. "No need." Scott straightened. Dumbledore and Flitwick were hurrying toward them from the castle's main building, both in pajamas, Dumbledore wearing a nightcap, and Flitwick looking as breathless as Scott felt. "Go take off his invisibility cloak, Lulu," Scott said, nodding toward the petrified figure. Lulu curtsied, dug through the cloak's folds, and with a gentle flourish removed it. The invisible fabric fell away to reveal the pale, rigid face of Elijah Caro. His terrified eyes flared with hate as soon as he saw Scott. Scott let a small, mocking smile cross his own face. "Idiot," he murmured under his breath. "You're finished." Flitwick barreled past Dumbledore to examine Scott. "Are you all right?" he demanded, scanning him from head to toe. Scott allowed the inspection with a weary grin. "I'm fine, Professor." "It's a relief," Flitwick said, exhaling. "When you left my rooms, your stamina was almost gone." Scott forced a smug half-smile. "Don't worry. Even if I had no strength left, someone like Mr. Caro wouldn't be able to ambush me." Flitwick chuckled. Dumbledore, walking over more slowly, laid a hand on Scott's shoulder. "By the time I heard the disturbance, he'd already begun casting Crucio," he said, apology threaded through his words. As he spoke, his Phoenix Patronus burst into being above his head, its silvery plume dissolving into smoke and folding back into him. Scott watched, impressed. "Oh, more interested in my Patronus than an old man's apologies?" Dumbledore asked with a smile. Flitwick craned his neck and admired it openly. "Albus, your Patronus is unlike any I have ever seen," he said. "Just a few small tricks," Dumbledore replied. Then he turned to Scott. "If you'd like, when you're ready I can teach you, after you can cast a full Patronus, of course." "Thank you, Headmaster," Scott said quickly. He believed that day wasn't far off. "Now, let's deal with this," Dumbledore said, looking at the motionless Caro. "Hello, Mr. Caro. Long time no see." Flitwick's face had hardened. "This isn't the first time, is it?" he snapped. "You attacked Scott on the bridge with several Slytherin boys, then accompanied Yaxley to the Forbidden Forest. You were expelled from Hogwarts, you narrowly escaped ministry sentences, and now this?" Dumbledore's expression was grave. "I'm curious about his motive. It certainly won't be Scott's fault." He glanced at Scott. "What do you think?" Scott shrugged. "Last time he said he was acting for his cousin Caitlin Roll. Maybe it's the same reason." "Then let's hear it from him." Dumbledore reached out and patted Mr. Caro's shoulder. The first pat broke the Petrificus Totalis. The second froze his body again before he could react. "You will answer my questions," Dumbledore said. "Why did you do this?" Caro kept his head down and remained silent. Scott's voice made him look up, and in a sudden furious motion a red flash shot from his mouth. Scott braced, turned his face away, and the attack missed. Spittle and a few bloody teeth spat toward Scott, but they hovered, suspended in the air. Flitwick had caught them with a quick charm. "Thank you, Professor," Scott said. Flitwick looked shaken. "I didn't know you hated him so much," Scott said quietly, eyes fixed on Caro. "Did I do something to you?" Caro refused to answer. Scott reached into his robes, pulled out a small vial, uncorked it, tilted the head back of the dazed Caro, and emptied the contents into his mouth. He pinched his chin to force it down. "At a time like this," Scott said dryly, "I'll take a page from Severus's book." Flitwick reacted with a start. "Scott, what did you just give him?" Dumbledore regarded Scott with a faint, amused look. "Veritaserum, I presume." Flitwick flushed. "That's against the rules," he protested. Dumbledore raised an eyebrow. "Rules are guidelines," he said, looking at the moment's urgency. "Besides, Minerva would not be the only one to worry about them." Flitwick capitulated with a nervous sigh. "It might be better in my office," Dumbledore said. "We should ask the questions where it's quiet." A song, soft and tuneful, descended from above as the phoenix itself drifted down, long tail feathers trailing like warm sunlight. "We can ride the phoenix. It will save us the climb," Dumbledore said, letting the bird perch on his arm. He winked at Scott, who stepped forward and plucked one of those shimmering tail feathers. The phoenix wrapped other feathers gently around Flitwick's and Carrow's wrists. "Lulu, the house elf is entrusted to you," Dumbledore told her. The phoenix lifted them, and a second of weightlessness later, they were stepping back onto the polished floor of the headmaster's office. Light and warmth greeted them inside. Scott bowed a quick thanks to the phoenix before turning to the limp figure of Elijah Carrow. "Speak, Elijah Carrow. Why did you attack me?" He answered slowly, the Veritaserum making his voice flat and hollow. "Because Caitlin wanted you dead." Flitwick barked. "Why? What has Scott to do with this?" "Caitlin wanted to avenge Jasmine Travers," Carrow said. "She wanted Trollope dead." "That's monstrous, avenging one death by harming the innocent," Flitwick said angrily. "Miss Travers's death had nothing to do with Scott." Carrow shrugged like a man tired of explaining. "I don't care about reasons. I only know Caitlin wanted him dead, and that was enough. I wanted to fulfill her wish. It was proof of my love." "Absurd," Flitwick said. "Utterly absurd." Scott leaned forward. "How did you get into Hogwarts? Who told you I'd be vulnerable tonight after dueling practice?" "I used a secret passage," Carrow said. "My family has been at Hogwarts for generations. We know some old ways in and out." He added that one passage's exit had been blocked, but with Tada's help, he'd cleared the stones. "And Strilner told you about my state?" Scott asked, puzzled. "Yes," Carrow replied. "Strilner has contacts. He keeps in touch with Slytherin circles. He had ways of finding out what he wanted." Scott's mouth tightened. He didn't like the idea of Strilner still meddling, but for now, the truth about the channels was all Carrow had. "Caitlin knew about tonight?" Scott pressed. Carrow's eyes grew distant. "No, Caitlin is dead." "Dead? She was just a girl." Flitwick's voice rose. "It was me," Carrow said plainly. The words fell like stones. "I killed her." The room went very quiet. "What happened?" Flitwick asked, worse than shocked. Carrow's voice was numb with confession. "She didn't love me. Even when I attacked Trollope for her, when I was expelled, when I was imprisoned by the Ministry for months, when I went to study at Durmstrang to be with her, I couldn't make her love me." He swallowed, then finished in the same flat tone Veritaserum forced from him. "So I killed her. I loved her so much. Why didn't she love me back?" Even drugged by Veritaserum, Mr. Carrow's face was wild with fury and grievance as he spat out the words. "We were engaged as children. I was her fiancé, her cousin. I treated her so well." He used the moment to unload everything he had been holding in. "I can forgive her for not loving me. No matter what, she would still be my wife. But she shouldn't have fallen in love with someone else, especially a girl." His voice frayed into hysteria. "Why? Travers is already dead. She still can't forget her." "Travers was a demon. She bewitched Caitlin with magic. She was just using her. Why won't Caitlin wake up from it? Why does she want to avenge her? I found a pendant Travers had. It had her portrait inside. At that time, I didn't blame her. I just hid the pendant. Later, when she found it, she denied giving it to Travers, and she destroyed it." Scott let out a small breath of relief. No wonder the pendant he had made wasn't on Mr. Carrow. He hadn't needed to destroy the evidence himself. "She doesn't love me, she doesn't want to marry me, and now she hates me," Mr. Carrow went on. "So the only thing left is to kill her. Heh, dead Caitlin would be obedient. She'd belong to me. I ran away from Durmstrang. I was going to join her after I killed Trollope. Caitlin always wanted to see Trollope dead. If he was dead, she would forgive me. Of course I failed. And Travers, damn her, she bewitched Caitlin. If she hadn't been killed by that foolish house elf, I would have killed her myself." Mr. Carrow's roar petered out and he slid into a coma. The headmaster's office fell into stunned silence. Dumbledore's face showed a rare shock. Flitwick, normally so emotive, drew a sharp breath. Mr. Carrow's words were pebbles dropped into still water, rippling through the whole room. On the wall, the portraits of former headmasters and headmistresses opened their eyes and began whispering among themselves. The sorting hat, idle on its stool, twitched. It opened an eye and its mouth. Fawkes, preening by the window, stretched and fixed his gaze on Mr. Caro. Scott practiced occlumency in silence, tamping down the tumult of thoughts inside his head. He did not press Mr. Caro further, too shaken, it seemed, to speak. Dumbledore was the first to steady himself. I must say, I have not been so surprised in a long time. He took off his half-moon spectacles, wiped them with a handkerchief, and replaced them. Mr. Caro certainly does not seem normal right now, Flitwick observed. I think he's gone mad. Scott blinked, feeling slightly numb, and asked one last question. Mr. Caro, since you snuck back from Durmstrang, how did you meet Strillner? How did you get information about me from him? At the Hog's Head, Mr. Caro replied. A few days ago, I disguised myself and hid there. I ran into him and asked for information. I see. That's all my questions. Scott turned to the two professors. Flitwick offered a consoling look. Mr. Caro is a murderer. He should be sent to Azkaban. He should have been there long ago, he said. You're right, Dumbledore agreed. I will contact Mr. Scrimgeour at the Auror office as soon as possible. Flitwick hesitated. The Ministry now, his worry showed, factional infighting had left the Ministry unstable. Dumbledore did not avoid the issue. Do not worry, there will not be much resistance in this matter. If the Rohr family tries to protect him, they will be isolated. That's good. Flitwick stood abruptly, his face grim. I must say, this conversation is distressing. Albus, we all know the Ministry cannot continue like this. I know, Filius, Dumbledore said. I am trying to change things, but it will take time. Of course I believe you, Flitwick replied, because you are Dumbledore. He gave a small, grateful smile. It's late, Scott, Flitwick added. Luckily tomorrow is the weekend, but you should go back to your dormitory and sleep. Scott agreed, and he and Flitwick left the headmaster's office together. They returned to the top of Ravenclaw Tower through the secret passage in Flitwick's office. On the way back, Flitwick promised, I'll keep an eye on this and make sure Mr. Caro receives the punishment he deserves. When Scott stepped into the empty common room, something of his tension melted away. He didn't go straight to his dormitory. Instead, he walked to a window, looking at his faint reflection in the glass. He silently tallied up the people he now considered enemies. His rule was simple. Anyone who had tried to take his life or threatened his family was his enemy. First, Jasmine Travers. Though she had been little, she had once tried to kill Scott directly. He engineered the accident that killed her. Then came Jasmine's companions, Caitlin Roll and Morgan Avery. Morgan had gone completely quiet after Jasmine's death, so Scott had stopped worrying about her. Caitlin was different. She sought vengeance and had once sent Scott a poisoned letter. Because of her, Scott had gained another enemy, Elijah Caro. The cousins had both wanted Scott dead. Scott had used a pendant to amplify the darkness in Mr. Caro's unrequited love, turning him into a simp-turned-villain. That plot had played out exactly as Scott planned. Mr. Caro's violent, unexpected attack had been dangerous, but Scott believed this time Caro would not escape Azkaban. Once he was locked away, Scott intended to find a way to kill him quietly, the same way he had dealt with Jasmine Travers's father. There were others, Borgin and Burks, who had hired people to harass Scott's family over the Marauders map. Mundungus Fletcher, the thief Borgin hired to go to Spain. To protect the map and his family's safety, Scott had silenced Fletch and Borgin permanently. The Yaxley family had once targeted Scott because of the Travers inheritance. Facing the threat from an entire pureblood clan, Scott had engineered the death of the Travers heir in Azkaban, hoping to make the inheritance ownerless. That, he believed, would remove the Yaxleys' motive. He had even secretly killed the Travers heir the Yaxleys proposed, Jack Yaxley. But plans don't always survive other people's greed. The arguments over the inheritance and the chaos at the Ministry derailed his schemes. Unexpectedly, the Yaxleys reached a compromise with the other eligible families and settled the succession relatively peacefully. Scott's direct revenge plan against them failed. Still, his actions had cost the Yaxleys dearly. Brandon Yaxley had died at Medea's hands, and Jock had been poisoned by Scott. Those losses weakened the family. They then made things worse for themselves by trying to play both sides in the conflict between Medea and Lord Voldemort. The family's strongest old man and his heir were both sent to Azkaban. Only Liam Yaxley, who had once escaped Scott's poisoned midge attack, remained to hold the house together. The Yaxleys, once one of Scott's greatest threats, were now much diminished. Now, Scott's principal enemies were fewer but far more dangerous. Medea, who openly sought to use his non-existence to rewrite history, and the shadow behind her, Salazar Slytherin, who wanted to consume him. 383. A history of humiliation. Scott had no way of dealing with Medea, who wanted to use him, or with Salazar Slytherin, who stood behind her. His only move against Medea had been to free Barty Crouch Jr. early, a loyal follower of Lord Voldemort. That act helped Voldemort regain some of his power sooner than expected, but it also altered more of the predetermined future and made the magical world situation far more tangled. The revelation of the prophecy hit Scott hard. For the first time, he felt tremendous pressure and a sharp taste of defeat. He had always been confident before, believing that if he progressed step by step, he would become a powerful and free wizard. Even Medea's sudden appearance had not seriously worried him. The prophecy changed everything. His time to grow had been constrained. He could barely handle Professor Flitwick's dueling training, let alone face the legendary Salazar Slytherin. It was impossible not to feel anxious. Scott tried to shrug off the useless emotions and not let them control him, but feelings are not perfectly obedient, and they kept resurfacing. He pushed open a window and let the cool night air wash over him, forcing his mind to empty as he stood in the breeze for a long while. "Scott?" He turned and saw Luna, in a nightgown, slipping down the stairs near the Ravenclaw statue. "Luna?" he said, surprised. "Not asleep yet at this hour? I just fell asleep and woke up again." She padded over in her slippers. "I was going to your dormitory to find you. Did you just come in from outside?" "Looking for me?" Scott blinked. "It was late. I was waiting to find you here, but I got too sleepy." Luna reached into the pocket of her nightgown and produced a letter. "Savannah asked me to give this to you. I got it after dinner." "Thank you." Scott took the envelope. Luna went to a nearby table, plucked the wand from behind her ear, and touched a candle to life. "I thought you might need light," she said. "Thanks." He sat, slit the envelope, pulled out the letter, and read. "Scott, are you all right? I've been worrying about you. I've been digging into the prophecy, and I finally found something I need to tell you right away. Salazar Slytherin once came here and brought disaster on our Doherty family. This is from my grandfather. It's always been a secret kept in the family. In every generation, only one person, the priest, knows this hidden, humiliating history." This part caught Scott's curiosity. The rest of what my grandfather told me. Over 1,000 years ago, when the fairy Morgan recovered King Arthur's body, she closed the passage between Avalon and our world. My ancestor, the first Doherty, served Morgan and was ordered to remain in our world to guard the gateway to Avalon. Over the centuries, the Dohertys prospered. We transformed the swamps around the passage into what's called the Oak Sea and carefully cultivated a sacred tree. With the Stonehenge we erected, the two guarded the passage. Scott pictured the towering oak he had seen and the Stonehenge hidden under its shade. About 1,000 years ago, Salazar Slytherin visited the Doherty estate. Before then, my family had no dealings with wizards. Slytherin, arrogant as ever, demanded they take him to the passage to Avalon. Naturally, his demand was refused. Scott already imagined the bloodshed to come, and he wasn't wrong. The enraged Slytherin lashed out. His power was overwhelming. Resistance and concealment meant nothing. A powerful wizard could even read minds. Slytherin slaughtered many of the Dohertys, forced his way into the Oak Sea, and reached the sacred tree in Stonehenge. At that moment, the druid priest told him, "Powerful wizard, we cannot stop you, but you cannot open the passage to Avalon. It has been closed for centuries." Slytherin snapped, "I have the key left by Merlin. I got it from Merlin's servant." The priest warned, "Your arrogance will bring you the cruelest fate. Avalon is ruled by 9 fairies. They will punish you severely." Slytherin laughed. "Fairies are only a bit stronger than witches. My path in magic has already gone far. There's no wizard alive who's much stronger than me." Neither the sacred tree nor Stonehenge could bar him. With the priest's despairing eyes on him, Slytherin drew the scabbard of the Sword of the Lake, the sword once belonging to King Arthur, and forced the passage into Avalon open. The priest called names, Morgan and the other fairies, begging them to mete out punishment. But no one came. Avalon had been emptied of its guardians. It had become a land without owners. Slytherin stepped into Avalon and a month later returned. He had stripped the bark from the sacred tree and covered it with writing. That bark, filled with his inscriptions, became a scroll. Scott realized this was the origin of the scroll of history. Slytherin had broken into Avalon, used Merlin's remaining 1,000-mile eyes to read the histories of the past and the destined shape of the future, and recorded them on the sacred tree's bark. Slytherin, the bringer of the Doherty's disaster, closed the passage again and left. The Druids, grieving, tried to salvage the dying sacred tree. 10 years later, Slytherin returned. He was still powerful, but aged. He seemed near death. He entered Avalon once more, closed the passage, and never came back. The elders believed he had buried himself in Avalon. They agreed to keep silent until their deaths. That history became a secret known only to each generation's priest. Scott let out a slow breath. The prophecy had said Slytherin was in a deep sleep. He was not truly dead. Savannah's letter continued. What I wrote above is what my grandfather told me, but it's not the whole truth. From the prophecy, Slytherin is planning something enormous. Forgive me, Scott. Though I am the priest now, I don't know how to face this. When Salazar reappears, whether it's you mentioned in the prophecy or the dwindling Doherty family, or perhaps both, we might face annihilation. Scott rubbed his throbbing temples. He was exhausted. Flitwick's dueling practice that evening, the fight with Caro, and then the long time standing in the cold had left him drained. Still, he forced himself to read the last lines. But I will not give up. I don't think you will either. You've always been so spirited, as if no difficulty can faze you. I have always believed in you. If I find more, I will write. Savannah Doherty. Scott folded the letter and pressed his fingers to his temples again. Are you all right? Luna asked softly. I'm fine, just tired, he said. Then go to sleep, she advised, or your brain will lose its defenses. He put Savannah's letter away, nodded and muttered, I'll go back. Good night. Good night. Luna waved and padded back up toward the dormitory stairs. Scott trudged back to his room. He didn't wake his roommates, didn't bother washing, and didn't reread Savannah's words. He fell into bed and slept immediately. The next morning, he was woken by distant cheering. He opened his eyes to an empty dormitory. The noise came from the Quidditch pitch, where a match was in full swing. He showered, ate, and hurried to the room of requirement. When he entered Helena's study, the Ravenclaw portrait stared at him in astonishment. How rare, Scott! You're actually late! The painting exclaimed. Sorry, he began. You should apologize to Mother, the portrait said. Scott bowed immediately. I'm sorry, Mother. She did not scold him, but asked, What happened? He told her about the previous night, the attack after dueling practice, and most importantly, Savannah's letter. Ravenclaw listened intently. So that's it. You found another piece of the puzzle, the portrait said. None of us knew what Salazar did after he left Hogwarts. He clearly went through much. We already suspected, Scott replied, and the Doherty oral history makes it clear Slytherin's greed for Avalon was planned. The scabbard of the Sword of the Lake, Ravenclaw said, nodding. That explains why Salazar had Medea marry into the Gaunt family. She shook her head. In those days at Hogwarts, I thought Salazar had changed, she said quietly. I did not expect him to be the same man after all. 384. Ravenclaw's Reading Club. Listening to Ravenclaw's lament from the portrait, Scott met her gaze in confusion. The painted Ravenclaw only shook her head and said no more. Scott could only swallow his curiosity. There are some things you cannot keep hidden, she told him. You are used to telling me everything, yet you hold back with others. I cannot give you the most direct help if you do not let them in. Scott was stunned. Perhaps because this Ravenclaw was only a portrait, he felt freer to be frank with her than with living people. Even before Professor Flitwick, who had helped him so much, he had held back. There were also things he had never told anyone. The only one who knew everything was Lambo, whom he had created. Do you think your actions are right? The portrait asked. Scott opened his mouth but found no answer. Do you think Dumbledore and Flitwick don't understand you? She pressed. No, Scott said after a moment, his voice dry. They should understand me. He still had self-awareness. His memories of another life had made him mature in some ways, but in front of elders like Dumbledore and Flitwick, he was still a very young, inexperienced man. Ravenclaw continued, "An elder, especially a wise one, can see through a young person easily. Your concealment doesn't accomplish much." "But," Scott began, "your interactions with Medea and receiving her gifts are not what concern me," Ravenclaw said. "If you want more help, you must learn to be more open. Otherwise, even those who want to help you won't know where to begin." Scott nodded instinctively. The portrait looked into his eyes. "I'm not telling you to be frank with everyone. Many people are not worth it. Nor am I asking you to reveal everything. Everyone has secrets, but with those worthy of your trust, be sincere. Above all, learn to trust." Scott worried she might be misunderstanding him and hastened to add, "I haven't treated my teachers and friends with false affection." "I know," Ravenclaw smiled. "That is why they still care for you." Scott nodded again. His respect for his teachers and his concern for his friends were genuine. He didn't want the portrait to think otherwise. "Just learn to trust," Ravenclaw said gently. "Everyone accepts help on the path to growing. No one avoids it entirely." Scott understood, but this was part of his nature, something he could not change overnight. Ravenclaw fell silent, and the lesson turned to other things. He left the room of requirement before dinner and walked toward the Great Hall, thinking the portrait might be right. Perhaps he should tell the professors what he knew about Medea and Slytherin. Lost in thought, he found himself on the 4th floor when someone called his name. "Scott!" He looked up to see Professor Black, newly back at Hogwarts, standing by the corridor railing with one hand raised. There were students coming and going near the spiral staircase, and Scott hadn't noticed Black until then. "Come here, Scott," Black called again. Scott altered his steps and climbed the stairs toward him. "Good evening, Professor Black," he greeted. Professor Black looked thinner, almost as he had the first time Scott met him. "Just call me Sirius," Black said with a loud laugh, clapping Scott on the shoulder. "I'm only an assistant teacher now." "Excuse me," Scott started to ask why he'd been called, but Sirius slipped his arm around Scott's shoulders and steered him along. "Come with me." They stopped at Sirius's office. The door opened and Sirius released Scott, stepping inside. Scott glanced in and saw Harry on the sofa in a near-paralyzed slump, utterly despondent. At the sound of the door, Harry turned his head slowly. "Sirius? Oh, Scott. Hello." "Hello, Harry," Sirius grinned. "I happened to see Scott out for some air, so I invited him to have dinner with us. It'll be a good chance for him to share his occlumency notes with you." He looked to Scott. "How about it? Come in. The house elves will bring the food." Scott couldn't refuse an invitation. He went in. Sirius settled beside Harry on the sofa. "I should be thanking you, Scott," Harry managed, perking up a little. "Thanks for the notes, and I'm sorry for being such a mess." "You already thanked me," Scott said, and sat on a single sofa across from them. He studied Harry for a moment. "What's wrong? Is occlumency that exhausting?" "Very," Harry said, in obvious pain. "I feel like my mind is constantly invaded by legilimency. My head's turning to mush." Scott could only look at him sympathetically. They ate in Sirius's office, and Scott described his experiences with occlumency training. As for how effective it was, Harry's bewildered expression said enough. It was the old problem. He could understand things inwardly, but had trouble expressing or reinforcing them. After dinner, Scott said goodbye to Godfather and Godson and hurried back to the Ravenclaw common room. He had promised Penelope and Kayla he'd attend the book club they were hosting. When he arrived in the Ravenclaw library, the club had already started. Penelope stood among a circle of students, speaking with effortless poise. Most of those present were first, second, and third years, though several older students and Scott's roommates were there too. Scott offered Penelope a sheepish smile and moved to stand by a bookshelf. Kayla slid in beside him and whispered, "I thought you were going to break your promise." "Sorry," Scott whispered back. As Penelope spoke, she suddenly introduced him. She praised Scott as a quintessential Ravenclaw, always at the top of his class, and urged the younger students to learn from him. The eyes of the younger ones turned to him. On the outside, he kept calm, but inside he burned with embarrassment. He did not see himself as a role model. Hard work. Every Ravenclaw worked hard. There was nothing else about him to emulate. Should they really learn how he'd meticulously set traps and killed to survive? If he could, he'd prefer a peaceful 7 years at Hogwarts. Next, Scott will share his study methods, Penelope announced, and applause followed. Roger and Eddie winked at him. Thank you. Scott stepped into the circle. The applause faded, and dozens of expectant faces turned to him. Fortunately, he'd prepared solid material. Hello, everyone. I'm Scott Trollope. It's an honor to speak with you. Today I'll share effective study techniques to improve your Transfiguration grades. He didn't lecture on specific spells. Instead, he outlined proven study methods he'd used. He steered clear of techniques that relied on his uncommon talents and focused on approaches anyone could apply. For 20 minutes, he spoke clearly and practically. When he finished, he received warm applause and spent 10 minutes answering questions. Then he sat back and listened as others, top students Penelope had invited, shared their own insights. Everyone excelled in different areas, and Scott listened with interest. The club ran late into the night as more students joined, and the discussion grew livelier. When they returned to the dormitory, Eddie asked, "Scott, where were you last night? We stayed up late, but you weren't back." "Yeah, and you were dead to the world this morning," Roger added. "Someone ambushed me under the tower last night, then I went to the headmaster's office," Scott said. The three roommates clustered around him, stunned. "Are you serious?" Eddie asked. "Who was it?" Roger demanded. "You weren't hurt, were you?" Milton fretted. "Don't worry," Scott said with a smile, taking a seat on the bed's edge. "He was defeated, and I'm fine." They all exhaled. "Who was it?" Roger pressed. "You went to Professor Flitwick again last night, didn't you?" Eddie guessed. They knew how exhausted Scott was after dueling training with Flitwick. Could it have been a first year? Roger offered. "It was Elijah Caro," Scott said. At the name Elijah Caro, the three faces displayed confusion. The name had slipped their memories. "I remember now," Eddie and Milton said almost together. "Didn't he go to Durmstrang?" Eddie asked. Scott leaned against the bedpost and recounted the whole sequence. The incident, the manipulations, and the runic circuit he had hidden in a pendant to influence Caro's thoughts. The story, part lily-scented love triangle and part the blackened simp scandal, left his roommates speechless. Even usually garrulous Eddie had no immediate comment. "I thought Roll's poisoned letter was bad enough," Milton said in a small voice. "I didn't expect." "That's nothing," Scott said. He knew his own methods were harsher. The pendant's runic circuit had been a calculated, malicious nudge. Roger blurted, "What will happen to Caro?" "Azkaban! He has to go to Azkaban!" Eddie shouted. "I'll write to my father and ask him to make sure Caro can't escape punishment this time," Milton said quickly, ignoring whatever distance might exist between him and his father. "My father is well placed at the ministry now." Scott started to refuse, but Milton's eyes were serious. "Don't refuse, Scott. You've helped me already. Writing to my father is the least I can do." Scott looked at him, moved by the earnestness, and smiled. "Thank you," he said sincerely, and did not refuse. Milton had even written the letter overnight, with Scott no longer objecting. The next morning, he skipped breakfast and went straight to the owlery to send it. Later, at the dining table, Milton said to Scott, "This will offend the Caro family, but it will also make the Roar family think more highly of my father. I don't think he'll refuse my request." Scott nodded solemnly and thanked him. Milton waved him off. "This isn't much. You've helped me many times." Eddie, grinning, chimed in. "You two are too polite." "We're friends," Roger said, looping an arm around Scott and Milton. "Helping each other is normal." Scott and Milton laughed. After breakfast, the group dispersed. Scott headed to the 8th floor to get to the room of requirement for class. As he walked a corridor, a wooden door materialized out of the stone wall to his right and opened of its own accord. He paused. "Good morning, Scott," Dumbledore's voice called from within the office. "Do come in." Scott stepped through. The first thing he noticed was a large portrait of Rowena Ravenclaw in the center of the wall. She sat poised, smiling at him. Around her, the other former heads were crowded toward the edges, as if reluctant to get too close. Dumbledore, sitting behind his desk, said, "My mentor, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Phileas are visiting today. She told me you wished to speak with me." Scott hadn't expected Rowena Ravenclaw to be pushing him. He glanced at her portrait, surprised, then politely greeted Dumbledore and Professor Flitwick. "Don't be nervous, child," Rowena's painted smile encouraged. No one in this office can reveal our secrets." A loud, fawning laugh came from a corner portrait. The portrait shifted aside to reveal a man with a scowling face, Phineas Black, tied with rope and muffled with a sock. The bald wizard who had been laughing raised a huge hand and slapped Phineas on the head. "We found him out," he crowed, then jabbed a few more blows into the portrait. Dillis Derwent sniped from the side. "We're portraits. We can't feel a thing. It's his reputation he cares about." The other former heads joined in, insulting Phineas and demanding Dumbledore ruin his name completely. Dumbledore's expression grew grave. "That would not be wise," he said quietly. "We cannot let the dead unduly affect the living." He was thinking of Sirius Black. Rowena Ravenclaw's voice cut through the rising din. "This matter ends here." Her flat command silenced them all. "Let my apprentice, Dumbledore, and Phileas speak in peace." With that, she faded back into her frame. The others retreated as well. The laughing bald wizard even hauled the bound Phineas out of sight. One by one, the paintings went blank. Rowena's solemnity left Scott feeling oddly awkward. He didn't know how to begin. "Sit down," Dumbledore said kindly, as if reading his discomfort. "What would you like to drink?" Scott relaxed at the headmaster's smile and sat. "Black tea. No sugar, please." "Of course." Dumbledore snapped his fingers, and a steaming cup of black tea appeared in front of him. Scott sipped and began to speak, imperfectly organized, telling whatever came to mind, about his interactions with Medea. Dumbledore and Professor Flitwick listened without interrupting. When he finished that part, Scott took the silver, snake-shaped necklace Medea had given him off his wrist and set it on the desk. He produced a small paper box from the shape-shifting, leathery bag at his side, a tiny toy-like fireplace, and a pouch of flue powder, and then recounted everything connected to Savannah, from the arithmancy session to the last letter she had written. Only when he had finished did he stop and wait. Dumbledore laughed softly. "Those are quite the adventures. Phileas, don't you think we were far tamer at that age?" Flitwick shifted, a little rueful. "I'm sorry I didn't notice sooner. Scott, you should have told us about what you'd been facing." Scott opened his mouth and felt suddenly ashamed and guilty. "I'm very sorry, Professor. It was my own greed. I accepted Medea's gift." Flitwick waved away any further reproach. "I understand. If I had been 14 or 15, I probably would have made the same choice." "We were all young once," Dumbledore added, blinking kindly. "Children don't always like to share their little secrets with adults." They did not dwell on his concealment. Dumbledore reached for the paper box and set the small fireplace on the desk. He smiled at Flitwick. "We need a channel to communicate with Miss Slytherin. This, using the Flue network as a private channel, is a clever idea." Flitwick glanced at the fireplace in Dumbledore's office and nodded. "It's a technology worth considering. It could improve efficiency in many ways." Dumbledore set the toy fireplace down again. "A pity Miss Slytherin has no intention of promoting it." He picked up the silver snake necklace and examined it. "A port key with special effects?" He handed it to Flitwick, who tested it with a few small charms, then returned it to Scott. "Keep it with confidence, child," he said. "It may not entirely conform to ministry regulations, but it will keep you safe. Miss Slytherin hasn't tampered with it." Scott took it back gratefully and thanked him. Dumbledore opened the flue powder and poured a pinch into the tiny fireplace. A whisper of green flame sparked to life with a soft pop. The headmaster looked at the little blaze like a boy given a new toy. He spoke the number he had been given for Medea with interest. "No, 001. The flame flickered, and Medea's voice came through, surprised. "Scott, I didn't expect you to contact me." "Hello, Miss Slytherin. I am Albus Dumbledore," Dumbledore said, introducing himself. "Principal?" Medea sounded even more astonished. "Have you discovered what that child concealed?" "No," Dumbledore said, giving Scott a glance. "Scott told me willingly." There was a pause at the other end. "I didn't expect that," Medea said after a moment. "He's not a child who gives his trust lightly." Scott lowered his head. Dumbledore's smile grew warm. "I'm honored to have earned his trust," he said. "It seems I may be a reasonably qualified headmaster." Medea scoffed. "Maybe he had no better choice. I like his personality, but don't mistake what you have for true trust. Scott is a child who notices only the benefits." Scott looked up, taken aback. Dumbledore met his eyes and reassured him before replying. If you recall, Scott's initial reason for meeting you was simply to help a friend. Medea's tone sharpened. I remember. I also remember that the boy called Greaves did not regain his musical talent because his friend was unwilling to make the necessary sacrifice. That's an absurd statement. Dumbledore did not agree with Medea. We can't reasonably expect one person to sacrifice themselves for another. From what I've gathered, Scott has done everything he could to help his friend. He paused, then added, But I didn't summon you, Miss Slytherin, to argue about that. You shouldn't be making things harder for a child. I'm not your student, headmaster, Medea replied coldly. Dumbledore ignored the sarcasm and said, I want to talk about the state of the magical world. Oh? Medea sounded mildly interested. What about it? I hope you and the wizards who've rallied to your cause will truly work for the betterment of our kind, as you claim, Dumbledore said earnestly. The Ministry of Magic is near collapse. Most people bicker for its own sake and neglect their duties. That won't bring a better future. Scott and Professor Flitwick exchanged looks. They both knew Medea's slogan might be more propaganda than principle. Her real aim seemed to be altering people's fates as recorded in the scroll of history. Could Dumbledore be flattering her? Then, surprisingly, Medea admitted, You're not wrong. Even stranger to Scott was how readily Medea owned the criticism. Could it be that the banner of "for a better future" needed to be defended at all costs? You know why the factional struggles at the Ministry happen, Medea went on, so I have a proposal. Please, Dumbledore invited. Tom is the biggest destabilizing factor in Britain's magical community, isn't he? Medea asked. He preaches pure-blood supremacy and won't treat everyone equally. His existence has indeed threatened peace, Dumbledore agreed calmly. Then join me to remove him, Medea suggested. If we remove Tom, this symbol of pure-blood obsession, we can crush the stubborn forces that value blood over merit. Only then can the magical world move forward. Dumbledore shook his head. He did not accept her plan. I want Tom gone, he said, voice heavy. He is a terrible dark wizard who has sown suffering and fear, but I will not join forces with you, Miss Slytherin. Medea laughed. You look down on me, headmaster, she said. I'm not noble by conventional standards. I've done things others would call malicious. That isn't the main issue, Dumbledore replied, still shaking his head. I don't demand nobility of everyone. Then why not? She pressed. Because you don't treat everyone equally either, Dumbledore said. You may despise Lord Voldemort's values, but you value ability above all. Your creed is meritocracy. Is there anything wrong with valuing talent? Medea asked genuinely. Scott could tell she truly did not see the problem. Dumbledore set out his view. We are all different, appearance, bloodline, ability, temperament, but I believe all people are equal in worth. Even the weakest have the right to exist. We should protect that right. That's the difference between humans and beasts. Beasts merely survive. We are capable of love. I understand what you're saying, Medea replied calmly through the flu, but it's impractical. She didn't wait for him to respond. To develop society, the first priority must be that talented people get better opportunities. The weak and inept should accept leadership from the capable. When they fall behind, they will be left behind. We must look at the whole. I believe some sacrifices are necessary. We can even remove impurities to strengthen wizards as a whole. Scott, sitting in the headmaster's office, recognized she meant it. Dumbledore listened and answered simply, Ordinary people are the majority. They're like a flock of sheep without a shepherd, Medea shot back. Headmaster, do you really think you, the greatest wizard of our age, and a witch who spends her days washing pots are of equal value to the future of wizarding kind? I see no moral difference between myself and a witch who washes pots, Dumbledore said quietly. That witch might be an ordinary wife, an ordinary mother, but she can give her family the deepest love. Medea fell silent for a moment, but she was unconvinced. I suppose neither of us will persuade the other, she said coolly. Then let the results speak for themselves. With that, she disconnected the flue. The green flames guttered out. Dumbledore shook his head and sighed. Why bother, Albus? Flitwick murmured. She's not someone with whom we can reach common ground. I wanted to know her true thoughts, Dumbledore said, whether she acts only on her father's orders or if she truly believes this. She doesn't strike me as friendly, Flitwick said. Dumbledore nodded. Although they differ in standard, Both she and Lord Voldemort sort people into hierarchies. If this continues, the ministry will only get worse, Flitwick added. Silence settled across the headmaster's office. Scott watched them both and kept quiet. His knowledge of politics came from a few high school civics classes long ago and a hazy memory of open-book university lectures. Dumbledore cleared his throat. Sorry, Scott. I was almost distracted. Scott stopped his wandering thoughts. What about Mr. Carrot? He asked. Scrimgeour has taken him into custody and notified the Roar family, who were affected, Dumbledore said. You'll need to testify. Do I have to go to the ministry for the trial? Scott asked. That's why I called you, Dumbledore replied with a smile. They've set the hearing for next Friday morning because of the Roar family's urgency. I'll take you to the ministry to testify. Oh, you can definitely testify this time, Flitwick said, sounding contrite. I'm sorry, Scott. Last time Carrot attacked you, what I promised didn't happen. That's not your fault, Professor, Scott said quickly. He didn't want Flitwick to carry guilt. This was a teacher who had been kind and straightforward, not a political schemer. Flitwick's involvement in such matters had always been limited. That's all for today, then, Dumbledore said, smiling at Scott. Rowena Ravenclaw has said you don't need to attend her class today. Perhaps take a day to rest. Rowena's right, Flitwick added, more kindly. You can skip Professor Babbling this afternoon and my lecture tonight. Go enjoy yourself with your friends. They looked at Scott with something like tender concern. Scott wanted to protest that he preferred studying to relaxing, but he accepted their kindness, thanked them, and left the headmaster's office. No sooner had he stepped into the courtyard than he almost ran into the Weasley twins, who were darting about like a pair of rogue bludgers. Each carried a monocular device, one moment peering at the sky, the next fiddling on the ground. They both stopped in unison and leveled their lenses at him. Oh, Scott, Fred called, brimming with pride. George shook his monocular like a maraca. Look what we've made. A monocular telescope? Scott approached them. No, Fred said, chin lifted. It's a magic camera. We did it, George crowed, hands thrown up. Scott examined what looked like a panoramic telescope missing a tube. So what's the difference between your magic camera and a panoramic scope? Is it just shorter? 387. Grubbly Plank has nothing to say. Fred and George were unfazed by Scott's skepticism about their invention. Of course not, Fred said, his triumphant grin undimmed. We based it on the panoramic telescope and improved it. You'll see how brilliant it is once you try it, George added, passing the monocular to Scott. Scott took it, turned it over in his hand, and raised it to his right eye, shutting his left. He peered into the lens. There are definitely changes, he said. You added a square viewfinder with the same proportions as the magic crystal player. I think you're just trying to pick a fight with us, George said, annoyed, snatching the device back and launching into a detailed explanation of its functions. Scott listened patiently, then nodded. Okay, I admit it's easier to use than the panoramic telescope. You can call it a magic camera. Humph, George said with mock arrogance. Admitting our superiority isn't so hard. Scott ignored the pretense, took the magic camera back, and poked at it for a moment. He couldn't deny the truth. As a product with a clear development goal, this was far more useful as a camera than the panoramic telescope. The panoramic telescope's biggest flaw when used for filming was that it could only capture continuous footage. When Scott had been making the Ravenclaw promotional video, he had to shoot a segment and immediately import it into the mirror for storage, clumsy and inconvenient. The twins' device, by contrast, used magic to replicate everything a Muggle camera did. Synchronized sound, flexible segment shooting, and far simpler operation. After a short spell of novelty, Scott handed the camera back. When are you going to make the Gryffindor promotional video? And when do you plan to mass-produce the magic camera? We'll get the house promo done as soon as possible, Fred said. Trust me, Scott, it won't be worse than Ravenclaw's. As for mass production, George laughed and slipped an arm around Scott's shoulders. We want to talk to you about something. Spit it out, Scott said. We're not launching it officially yet, George said. This will be one of Weasley's Wizard Wheez's signature products. So? Scott asked, confused. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes doesn't even exist. We'll save up the money, Fred said, before graduation. Scott laughed. I don't object. I can authorize it for you. I'm not planning to run the business myself, and I trust you two won't cheat me. His philosophy had always been hands-off. Collect the money, act as a major shareholder. The twins cheered. Scott suggested they team up with Eddie. Eddie's dream was to start a whole new kind of media company to challenge the wizarding world's backward reliance on print news and its paucity of entertainment. Fred and George agreed at once and decided to go find Eddie to talk about it. After bidding them farewell, Scott headed toward the back of the castle. He'd planned to use the free day to visit his oak cottage in Raven territory and to see Lambo, who had apparently been behaving quite wildly. His route was interrupted when he ran into Miss Grapeland outside the Forbidden Forest, walking a young Thestral. Because the area by the forest was open, she had seen him before he sensed her. "Hello, Scott," she called, waving. Scott wasn't keen on the woman's company, but he nodded and walked over. "Hello, Miss Grapeland." He kept glancing at the Thestral, which had grown noticeably. The creature snorted. It seemed to remember him. "He's grown a lot and looks very healthy," Grapeland said, a touch of pride in her voice. "I've taken good care of him, haven't I?" "You have," Scott said. Seeing how comfortable she and the Thestral were together, he believed Luna had been right. The creature had been tamed by Grapeland. "That's remarkable, Miss Grapeland," he said. Before this, Professor Hagrid was the only wizard in Britain known to have tamed Thestrals. "No, I didn't tame him." She stroked the Thestral's bony neck and smiled softly. "We're just close." Scott smiled thinly and didn't press it. Grapeland went on, "I don't try to tame creatures. I prefer Newt Scamander's approach. I try to befriend them. Of course, Mr. Scamander is the most accomplished at that." "Mr. Scamander is certainly an admirable expert on magical creatures," Scott said politely, inwardly skeptical. He liked Newt's work, but he doubted Grapeland shared that philosophy in practice, especially since he'd heard she'd once attacked centaurs in the name of academic credits. She must sense his skepticism, because she moved on. "So, how are you finding the Scholar Alliance?" she asked. "Not good," Scott replied flatly. "I haven't opened the Book of Prometheus in days." Grapeland looked surprised. "How is that possible? Are you doing this on purpose? You don't want to owe me a favor because of that?" Scott's expression didn't change. "What we had was a transaction, Miss Grapeland, an equal magical contract. No one owes anyone anything." "You're a sly boy," she said, displeasure showing. "You won't admit it after getting the benefit." "I didn't get any benefit." Scott watched her as she drew deeply on the pipe in her mouth and exhaled slowly. She composed herself before continuing. "Aside from the academic credits I paid for, because I promised, I recruited you into the Scholar Alliance. That should be repayment enough. The Alliance isn't open to just anyone. Isn't the knowledge the Book of Prometheus can give you worth that?" Scott remained unmoved. "Putting aside whether you even had the authority to recruit me into the Alliance," he said, watching her closely. Her eyes flickered, and he saw the momentary hesitation that confirmed his suspicion. Grapeland hadn't made the recruitment decision herself. "The Book of Prometheus isn't very useful to me," he went on. "I have a clear plan for my magical path, and the professors have approved it. Everything I need I can learn at Hogwarts. Why chase obscure knowledge just to earn credits? It would be a waste of time." Grapeland was briefly taken aback. "But in the future, where will you get the higher, more secret knowledge? You're a young wizard of Muggle origin." Scott laughed. "Tell me, in the Scholar Alliance, is there a Charms Master better than Professor Flitwick? Are there Transfiguration Masters better than Professors Dumbledore or McGonagall?" She was stumped. Of course she couldn't name anyone more authoritative in charms or transfiguration than those three. "Whether you believe it or not, those professors won't refuse any of my requests for guidance," Scott added. "You may have heard Professor Flitwick even takes time to train my dueling skills." Grapeland shut up. Scott felt a small swell of pride. He hadn't even mentioned Ravenclaw and had already silenced her. "So the Book of Prometheus isn't essential to me." He shrugged, though the book wasn't as useless as he claimed, but he wouldn't let Grapeland use it as leverage. With that, he waved briefly, past her, and strode into the Forbidden Forest. 388. The Patronus charm finally succeeds. Scott walked into the Forbidden Forest. Through his magical senses, Grapeland stood motionless. He could feel the woman's gaze fixed on him. Grapeland said nothing, and Scott did not look back. He pushed farther into the trees, and after confirming again with his magic that no one was nearby, he channeled power into the silver, snake-shaped necklace on his left wrist and slipped through space. In the blink of an eye, he was already deep in the woods, far from the forbidden forest, in Raven territory among towering oaks. Caw! 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 The sudden intrusion startled the ravens nesting in the branches. A chorus of annoyed caws rose and fell. Several birds swooped down and circled him. "Is Lambo here?" Scott asked. "Go fetch him." Caw, caw. The ravens seemed to understand. After a few calls, they flew off, disappearing into the canopy. Scott drew his flying broom from the morphing lizard skin bag and rode it up to the top of the largest oak. As he rose, the oak cottage, previously hidden by enchantments, materialized before him. He landed on the wooden porch, leaving clear footprints in the dust, set the broom down, produced his wand, and began to clean. Inside, the small wooden house was thankfully cleaner than the exterior suggested. He cleaned quickly, made the bed with the bedding from the cabinet, and lay down, arm under his head, muscles finally relaxing. Just as he was about to drift off, he felt his pocket vibrate. Scott sat up, alert, and pulled the Scholar Alliance ID card from the lining of his robe. The card trembled a few more times, then fell still. Curious, he poured a little magic into it. The card swelled and unfolded into the Book of Prometheus. On a blank page, a simple outline of an owl appeared, flapping its wings with a letter clasped in its beak. Scott raised an eyebrow and pointed. The owl released the envelope. It unfolded as it descended, the paper expanding to fill the page. The letter read, "Hello, Scott Trollope. Welcome to the Scholar Alliance. Sorry for the delay. Stephanie has just told me about you. Yes, your guess is correct. Recruiting you into the Scholar Alliance was not Stephanie's decision, but mine. Although we have not met, I know you very well and admire you greatly. I appreciate you very much, so please be assured I will not do anything to harm you. This contact is simply to say hello. You are clever and talented, and I hope we can get along well. BB." Scott clicked his tongue. The hidden hand behind Stephanie had shown itself rather eagerly. He read the short message twice, weighing what it implied, thinking over everything that might have given them any knowledge about him. He reviewed his past transgressions, especially the murders, and admitted the possibility that some trace could have been found. But no matter how he turned it over, he could not think of any evidence anyone could produce that would truly endanger him. With that settled, he let out a small, measured breath. If he responded now, he would be playing into the other party's game. Whether he interrogated them about their identity or tried to dig out information, they would control the conversation. And the more he thought about it, the recruitment through Grapeland, the prompt follow-up message after Scott realized Grapeland wasn't really in charge, the deliberately ambiguous phrasing, the more it looked like they were trying to get under his skin. No need to rush. He would keep calm and let the other side reveal themselves in time. With that in mind, he closed the Book of Prometheus and let it shrink back into the card. He took a parchment from the morphing bag and began to study. It contained the animagus material he had bought with his credits. Under Professor McGonagall's guidance, his preparations were nearly complete. He understood the theory and the ritual steps. He had merely been cautious about beginning the physical transformation. There was another, more immediate reason he had held off. His Patronus charm still wouldn't fully form. He knew why. The Patronus charm required drawing on one's happiest memory to guide the magic, and whenever he tried to summon that joy, something felt absent, like an itch scratched through a boot. Memories from his previous life were not entirely helpful. More problematically, that past life left him with the fraud identity of someone who technically shouldn't exist here. That trace of another existence made some charms misbehave. At first, when he attempted the Patronus, he instinctively reached for the happiest recollections from his previous life. The emotions those memories dredged up were thin and hollow. The charm produced only an illusory silver vapor sphere. When he used memories from this life, the charm smoothed out. He could conjure the silvery smoke, but he had never bridged the final step. He knew, intellectually, that if he completely accepted this life and let the other life become truly past, the Patronus would respond, but he could not, until now, force himself to make that clean break. Reading the anonymous letter had triggered something. He made a decision. "I've reincarnated," he said aloud in Mandarin. "The past life is the past life. This life is this life. From now on, no, since birth, 15 years ago, I'm no longer Wei Shi." He shifted languages as his voice firmed. "Wei Shi is dead. I am Scott Trollope." He rose slowly, drew his wand, and let those warm, genuine memories surface. Memories with his parents, Michael and Amelia. Their faces, their voices, the easy comfort of home filled him. He planted his feet and spoke clearly. Expecto Patronum. Silver smoke burst from the wand and congealed into a nimble figure that spread its wings and zipped around him, a streak of light leaving after-images in its wake. Scott smiled. Perhaps life did need a little ritual after all. He concentrated, urging the figure to slow. The apparition obeyed, its flight calming, and he saw it clearly. It was a raptor, sleek and majestic, a peregrine falcon. He'd read about them, medium-sized falcons in the Falconidae family, famed for their speed, capable of diving as fast as 418 kilometers per hour. The silver peregrine hanging in the cottage air looked streamlined and fierce even in its ethereal form. Scott felt satisfied. If nothing unexpected occurred, that species would also be his animagus form, fast, aerial, and perfectly suited to the kind of freedom he valued. "Scott!" A black blur shot through the open door of the cottage and stopped abruptly in front of him. Lambo had returned. "Why did you come here?" Scott asked. Lambo glanced up at the Patronus with a look of curiosity mixed with annoyance. "What kind of magic is that?" he demanded. "Why didn't you turn into a raven?" 389. The trial that didn't go well, Patronus charm. Scott answered Lambo's question. "I can't control its form." He waved his wand again, and the Patronus dissolved into silver smoke. Lambo had never seen the charm before. After the peregrine falcon faded, it flew and landed on the desk beside Scott. "Well, since you didn't conjure it on purpose," it said, "you can't be blamed." Scott nodded gravely. "Why did you suddenly come here?" Lambo asked. "I was just about to go to Hogwarts to find you." Scott sat back down. "It seems you already know about Caro." "Of course," Lambo said. "The Ministry's been buzzing about Caro and the Rolls for the past 2 days. They say Caro has been on the run since he killed Caitlin Roll." "Oh, right." Lambo flapped its wings. "They say he was arrested because he snuck into Hogwarts and attacked a student. Was that you?" "It was me," Scott said, and then he told Lambo everything that had happened. When he finished, Lambo looked up at him, surprised. "I don't know when it started," it said, "but these strange incidents keep happening to you more and more. Is it really because of that prophecy?" Scott felt uncertain when the topic came up. He sighed. "Whatever the cause, what needs to be faced will be faced." He then asked in detail about the Ministry's current stance on the Caro case. From Lambo's explanation, he learned his testimony at the trial next week would be a formality. Even without the Hogwarts attack on him, Caro was already doomed. Caitlin Roll's death had torn the Roll family apart and shaken their ties with the Caro family. The Caros, all Slytherins by tradition, had long been loyal followers of Lord Voldemort. Many members of the Rolls had gone to Ravenclaw for their studies, making their allegiances less clear. They hadn't openly sided with Voldemort. One could only say they had once been close to his circle, and it was hard to tell how much influence the Caro family had exerted. But since Caitlin Roll died at Elijah Caro's hands, the Roll family had rallied under Medea's flag. With the plaintiff and defendant now evenly matched in influence and the impartial legal enforcement squad overseeing things, the Wizengamot at the Ministry would enforce the law fairly and strictly. "Don't go to the Ministry for a while," Scott warned Lambo. "I'm worried Medea might find you. She could be anywhere." At the mention of Medea, Lambo shivered. It had once been confunded by Medea without realizing it. The experience still haunted it. Scott added, "After Caro is sent to Azkaban, you should make a trip there." Lambo cocked its head. "Do you want him to die in Azkaban? Like Travers?" "There are also those two from the Yaxley family in Azkaban," Scott said. "We should deal with them too, or else." Lambo, far cleverer than it had seemed, understood immediately. "You're worried Voldemort might regain strength, attack Azkaban, and break his followers free." Scott nodded. "All right," Lambo said. I'll go to Azkaban after Caro is imprisoned. It's the best place for me. Those Dementors will ignore me. Scott stayed at Oak Cottage all day. Just before dinner, Lambo accompanied him to the edge of the forbidden forest. He walked through the trees alone, and after emerging, ran into Grapeland again. This time she didn't speak first. She just smiled at him in a way that meant something. Good afternoon. Scott glanced at her, offered a small reply, and kept walking toward the castle without looking back. Scott, Grapeland called. He stopped and turned, giving her a questioning look. Mr. B has already contacted you, hasn't he? She said with that same knowing smile. I just want to remind you, the help Mr. B can give you goes beyond what you imagine. Scott showed no sign of being swayed. He stayed expressionless. Mr. B, he said. Doesn't he have a proper name? Grapeland wasn't offended by his mild sarcasm. You'll know, she said, smiling. Scott returned the smile. Then we'll discuss it when he has a proper name. He ignored her and went straight into the bustling great hall. Scott, Milton at the Ravenclaw table, stood when he saw him. Scott, my father replied to my letter. Scott changed direction and walked with Milton to a quieter spot at the edge of the hall. My father said he won't need to do anything. Caro will definitely be imprisoned in Azkaban, Milton said, disappointment softening his voice. I'm sorry. Maybe he said that because he didn't want to help. I think he's right, Scott said, patting Milton's shoulder. Professor Dumbledore told me about this. Don't worry. Caro won't escape the punishment he deserves. Your father doesn't need to do anything more. Milton brightened. Time moved quickly to Friday, the day of Caro's trial. After breakfast, Scott went to the headmaster's office with his friend's blessings. Professor Dumbledore was already waiting. Good morning, Scott. We should depart, Dumbledore said. He rose, walked to the fireplace, and asked, Do you know how to use the Flu network? I do, Professor. Very well. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Dumbledore tossed a handful of Flu powder into the hearth. Ministry of Magic. Green flames flared and Dumbledore vanished. Scott took a handful of Flu powder, stepped in, and said, Ministry of Magic. As the powder puffed, a blur of images flashed past his eyes. When the world refocused, his body staggered forward from the momentum. Are you all right? Dumbledore asked from outside the fire. I'm fine, Professor, Scott said, stepping out. They stood in a magnificent hall, the floor a polished dark wood. The peacock blue ceiling was inlaid with sparkling golden symbols that shifted and shimmered like a moving billboard. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and gilded fireplaces punctuated the panels. Every few seconds, with a soft pop, a wizard would appear from the fireplace on the left. On the right, people queued in front of fireplaces to depart. This is the atrium, 8 floors below ground, Dumbledore explained, as he led him past the circular pool known as the Fountain of Magical Brethren. Scott studied the fountain. In its center stood pure gold statues of a wizard, a witch, a centaur, a goblin, and a house elf. The tallest was a noble-looking wizard, wand raised to the sky. Surrounding him were a beautiful witch, a centaur, a small goblin, and a house elf. The centaur, goblin, and house elf looked up with adoring expressions. Streams of water shot from the tips of the wizard's wand, the centaur's arrowhead, and the house elf's ears. Dumbledore, lowering his voice, murmured, Our relations with those creatures never were that good. I've always thought the Fountain of Magical Brethren is more a fountain of hypocrisy. Scott smiled and glanced at the glittering sickles and nuts in the pool. A stained sign nearby read, All proceeds from the Fountain of Magical Brethren are donated to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. They passed the security checkpoint. With Dumbledore present, the officials moved quickly through the formalities. He led Scott into another hall, where at least 20 elevators stood behind ornate golden grills. We're heading to the trial chamber on the 9th subterranean level, Dumbledore said. It was abandoned for a long time, but I've heard it was recently brought back into use. An elevator descended with a clink. They took it down 1 floor. When the doors opened, they walked into a bare corridor and followed it to a stairway leading down. The corridor and stairs were like Hogwarts dungeons. Rough stone walls, torches in brackets, heavy wooden doors with iron bolts and keyholes. I remember, the 10th trial chamber, Dumbledore muttered. He led Scott to a gloomy black door with a large iron lock, turned the handle and entered. The trial chamber was a deep, dark room of pitch-black stone. Torchlight barely pierced the gloom. Rows of benches rose up on either side and were sparsely occupied. At the very front, the highest benches were almost full. Scott looked up and saw 40 or 50 people in plum-colored robes with a silver W embroidered on their chests. Everyone seemed focused on the sunken center of the chamber. In the chair at the center sat the defendant, Elijah Caro, head bowed, wrapped in thorny iron chains. "I need to go to the front," Dumbledore whispered. "Find a place to sit." "All right, Professor." Dumbledore walked forward. His star-patterned robe shifted into the same plum-colored robe as the others above. Scott climbed a nearby flight of seats, past a few wizards who watched him coldly, and sat at the edge of an empty row. A short, stout figure rose from the central seat at the top of the chamber. It was Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge. "Very good," he said loudly. "Everyone is here. Let's begin." No one objected. Fudge continued. "The trial of April 15th concerning Elijah Caro for multiple serious violations of the law. Interrogators: Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic. Amelia Bones, Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Albus Dumbledore, Chief Wizard of the Wizengamot. Trial Recorder, Jeremiah Greaves, Chief Secretary to the Minister." Scott followed Fudge's gesture and saw Mr. Greaves, Milton's father, seated as the recorder. He looked stylish and proud. As if sensing Scott's gaze, he glanced over and gave a slight nod before returning his attention to the proceedings. Fudge picked up a stack of documents. "The trial begins," he read. "The defendant is accused as follows. On the evening of April 1st at 9 p.m., the defendant murdered Caitlin Roll at Durmstrang Institute, then covertly returned to Britain." A woman in the front rows began to sob. Fudge read on. "On the evening of April 8th at 10 p.m., the defendant unlawfully entered Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry and attacked an innocent student." Many eyes turned involuntarily toward Scott. He kept his gaze on Fudge, who stared down at Caro. "Are you Elijah Caro?" he demanded. "Yes, Caro," Caro replied in a weak voice. "Do you admit to the charges brought against you by this court?" "No," Caro said. "I didn't do it." His denial rippled through the chamber. Everyone knew the facts of the accusations. Many had expected the defendant to protest, but his flat denial was jarring. "You're lying," a sharp female voice cried out. Scott turned toward the sound. A middle-aged witch in a plain black robe had stood, voice trembling with fury. "It was you. You are a demon," she yelled. "You killed my daughter." It was Caitlin Roll's mother. Her shrill cry stunned the chamber. Then a stout young witch rose, smiling awkwardly. "You can't make accusations without evidence, cousin," she said. "Electo." Roll's mother snapped, turning to her with hatred. "You damned! Silence!" Fudge barked. "Sit down. Do not disturb the court." The two women glared at each other, but sat. Roll's mother leaned on her husband's shoulder and sobbed. Once quiet returned, Fudge called, "Call the plaintiff's witness, Leonie Zimmerman." No one rose. Fudge repeated, "Call the plaintiff's witness, Leonie Zimmerman." Still there was no movement at the main door. Someone stifled a snicker. Scott's magical perception spread through the chamber and found the source, the stout young witch who had just defended Caro. "What's going on? Where is Leonie?" Roll's mother demanded, anxious to find the named witness, but her husband held her back. "Presiding judge." Caro, who had been sitting silent in the center, looked up. "Since the plaintiff's witness is absent," he said calmly, "may I call a defense witness?" Fudge had not expected that. "You, what witness do you have?" He snapped. "Someone who can prove I did not kill Caitlin Roll," Caro said with a smile. Fudge glanced at Amelia Bones on his left and at Dumbledore on his right. "Call the defendant's witness," Madame Bones said firmly. Dumbledore nodded. "Call the defendant's witness." Fudge barked, though his displeasure was clear. Scott turned toward the main door, eager to see who could possibly testify to Caro's innocence. He hadn't expected a trial that seemed so cut and dried to take such a dramatic turn. Ministry of Magic, 10th Trial Chamber. Everyone in the chamber, Scott included, stared at the tightly shut door. Under all those eyes, it swung open, and a tall, thin, middle-aged wizard stepped in. He wore a fur-trimmed robe, his hair was short and white, and a goatee curled at the end of a sharp chin. "It's him," Mr. Roll, still supporting his wife, blurted out in surprise. "Igor Karkaroff." The name rippled through the room. Karkaroff's entrance set off a murmur. The current headmaster of Durmstrang, a former Death Eater who had betrayed his comrades. If summoning a witness for the defense had already been unexpected, the identity of that witness was even more so. People whispered, Karkaroff? How could it be him? He had confessed to Crouch about many Death Eaters to escape punishment. Scott frowned at the reaction. Karkaroff's presence caused confusion and outrage in equal measure. He watched Karkaroff step forward and stand beside the defendant, Elijah Caro. I object, Mr. Roll shouted. The chamber fell silent. All eyes turned to Cornelius Fudge on the bench. Fudge looked uncertain, glancing to Amelia Bones and Albus Dumbledore on either side of him. Let's hear what Karkaroff has to say, Bones suggested, monocle flashing. Dumbledore, measured as always, added, After he's finished, we will judge the truthfulness of his testimony. Fudge nodded and called, Igor Karkaroff, state your testimony. Karkaroff bowed slightly and flashed a yellow-toothed smile. No problem, presiding judge. He spoke smoothly, and Scott felt uneasy. Amelia Bones and Dumbledore had not objected to him testifying. Neither had the protesting Mr. Roll, who quieted and sat again. That was odd, unless the Rolls had other evidence to counter this witness. Karkaroff began. Miss Roll's death was not caused by Mr. Caro. Mrs. Roll sprang up, screaming, You're lying. If it wasn't him, why would he run away? He killed my daughter. Silence, Fudge snapped. Mr. Roll hauled his wife down and tried to soothe her. Fudge turned back to Karkaroff. Do you have any evidence for your claim? Karkaroff inclined his head. I'll give the context, Your Honor. All students at Durmstrang knew that Miss Roll, Caitlin, was difficult. She was often moody. She would hit and berate Mr. Caro. Several students saw them quarreling on campus. Mrs. Roll tried to interrupt, but her husband muffled her. Fudge, unimpressed, said, That doesn't prove your point. Of course, Karkaroff said, as if humbly conceding. Still, it's background. The incident occurred on April 1st, April Fool's Day. Miss Roll's body was found in a secluded corner of the school by students. As headmaster, I opened an inquiry. A student told me Mr. Caro had called Miss Roll away that evening. Another said they'd heard them arguing. Because Caitlin often behaved like that, the students didn't go closer. By the time my staff and I tried to locate Mr. Caro, he had already left Durmstrang. The crowd listened, puzzled. His account painted Caro in a bad light. Caro and the Caro family observers were restless. Then Karkaroff's tone shifted. At first, I thought Mr. Caro had killed her, he admitted, but our examination turned up inconsistencies. He paused. Muffled sobs from Mrs. Roll filled the room. Miss Friedrich of the Durmstrang Infirmary examined Miss Roll. We found Mr. Caro had only stunned her with a stupefy. Her actual cause of death was poisoning. Bound to the chair, Elijah Caro answered, Principal Karkaroff is correct. I only stunned Caitlin with a stupefy. Their statements fit awkwardly together, full of gaps. Fudge's expression darkened. If you only used a stupefy, Mr. Caro, then why did you flee Durmstrang? Caro looked down, voice contrived and plaintive. I was distraught. I went to Durmstrang for Caitlin, but she was cruel to me. After we argued, I lost my temper and hit her with a stupefy. I couldn't take being treated like that any longer. I left. Scott felt sick hearing the hypocrisy. This was the same man who had sworn to stay with Caitlin until her last wish was fulfilled. Fudge scribbled on his notes and then turned to Karkaroff. You say she was poisoned, but why didn't you inform the Roll family when her body was returned? And how do you know the defendant didn't administer the poison? Karkaroff answered, Miss Friedrich can attest to the findings, presiding judge. The chamber door opened again. A very tall witch entered, at least 6'3", broad-shouldered and almost masculine in stature despite wearing a healer's gown and with long golden hair. She walked straight to Karkaroff and stood beside him, looming over him by half a head. Fudge looked annoyed. I did not summon you, madam. She paid him no mind. Calmly, she withdrew a small glass phial from her pocket and held it up. This is the poison found in Miss Roll's mouth, she said flatly. I tested it. It's a Muggle drug. Wizards have no record of using it. Karkaroff continued. Presiding judge, some time ago a figure appeared in Britain who specialized in poisoning pure-blood wizards. Mr. Borgin and the Yaxley family were struck. The culprit was called the Hidden Poison Wizard. Scott's brow tightened. Miss Friedrich, tall, blunt, added, I examined Liam Yaxley, who was attacked by the Hidden Poison Wizard. The Yaxleys preserved a sample of poisoned blood. On comparison, the poison in their sample matches this file. Fudge was quick to interrupt. You still haven't produced decisive evidence. If you can't, I will rule your testimony inadmissible. Karkaroff's eyes hardened. Everything we've said is true. Miss Friedrich and I are prepared to undergo veritasurum. Me too, Elijah Caro said, looking up. I will too. The announcement sent a ripple through the room. Scott's mind snapped to attention. Their confidence revealed their trick, memory modification. If someone had skillfully altered their memories, the false memories would feel real. Even veritasurum would confirm those implanted memories. Legilimency might uncover the tampering, but legilimency results aren't admissible as evidence. Bones and Dumbledore exchanged small, meaningful looks and leaned toward Fudge to confer in hushed tones. Scott felt uneasy. Karkaroff and Miss Friedrich, invoking the hidden poison wizard, made a bell toll in his head. He felt a small vibration in his chest, and his face tightened. He slipped his Scholar Alliance ID from his inner robe pocket and, hidden beneath his cloak in the back row, transformed it into the Book of Prometheus. The owl outline unfurled as he touched the page. A quick, crisply penned note appeared. Clever little fellow, if you don't show me more respect, Karkaroff and Miss Friedrich will tell everyone in the chamber that you're the hidden poison wizard. B. Scott's jaw worked. He closed the book and scanned the room, trying to spot Mr. B among the crowd. Magic perception wrapped the chamber, but could not replace sight. It didn't reveal the small, furtive movements he needed to find his anonymous ally. Before he could do more, Elijah Caro suddenly spoke up on his own. There's something I want to make clear, he said loudly. I infiltrated Hogwarts to find the hidden poison wizard and avenge Caitlin. Fudge blinked. You mean the student you assaulted is the hidden poison wizard? Yes, him. Caro twisted in his restraints, craning toward the back of the chamber. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He's Scott Trollope. All eyes swung to Scott. He didn't have to act. The first flicker of his face showed surprise, then helplessness, then a pleading look at Dumbledore. Dumbledore gave him a quiet, steadying glance. Scott glared at Caro, gritted his teeth, and did his best to look like a bewildered student falsely accused. Bones spoke, sharp and incredulous. Mr. Caro, that claim is absurd. You assert Miss Roll was killed by the hidden poison wizard, and then you identify a current Hogwarts student as that wizard? She turned to him, demanding logic. Tell us, how could a present Hogwarts student possibly have gone to Durmstrang to murder Miss Roll? 391. Fudge cuts the Gordian knot. Scott was very curious in that moment. He wanted to see how Mr. Carrot and the others would pin the label Hidden Poison Wizard on him. To the 50 members of the Wizengamot presiding over the trial, and to the wizards listening in, Scott was just an insignificant Hogwarts student. A hidden poison wizard who had once caused panic and an underage pupil were not the same thing. Scott was sure he had been careful. He had left no trace. Even if someone suspected him, without conclusive evidence, the accusation would sound absurd. He could tell from the reactions in the courtroom. Mr. Carrot shouted and raved, but most people thought he was making wild accusations. The Wizengamot members at the bench watched Mr. Carrot and the two defense witnesses with skepticism. Although all three had offered to submit to veritasurum, no one believed every word. Even those friendly to the Caro family would, at best, only give them verbal support. Seeing everyone's reactions, Scott calmed down. He watched Mr. Carrot below with a cold eye and waited to hear how he would answer Legal Enforcement Squad Chief Bones's question. After glaring at Scott for a long while, Mr. Carrot, whose neck had been twisted in an awkward posture, finally straightened it and answered Bones with righteous indignation. I don't know. He's a wizard. He has many ways to do it. Fudge snapped at him. Evidence. Any allegations require evidence. We will not accept baseless accusations. Dumbledore spoke then, turning his attention to Scott in the corner of the courtroom. I can testify for my student. This semester, Scott Trollope has not left Hogwarts prior to today. He is only a 5th year and has not learned apparition. A few of the wizards present smiled kindly at Scott. Most, however, watched with cold or hostile eyes. Scott ignored them and returned Dumbledore's grateful look, playing the part of an ordinary underage student. Mr. Carrot sneered. You don't need evidence for that. Just search Trollope's belongings. Maybe you'll find the same poison on him. Scott frowned. Search his belongings? He wasn't afraid of that. Everything he didn't want anyone to see was at Oak Cottage, protected by the Fidelius charm. Besides, the Wizengamot would not allow a search without cause. It was illegal to search a wizard, let alone an underage one, on the basis of unfounded accusations. Bones cut Mr. Carrot off decisively. Impossible. We will not search someone without reasonable suspicion of lawbreaking. Fudge turned the proceedings back to the main issue. First, we must verify the accusation that Elijah Jaden Carrot murdered Miss Roll. Mr. Carrot blurted that Principal Karkaroff and Miss Friedrich had already confirmed they weren't the murderer and volunteered to take a Veritaserum test. Karkaroff added that they had not revealed the truth to the Roll family beforehand because they feared alerting the real murderer. He bowed apologetically to Mr. and Mrs. Roll in the gallery, an action that made the grieving couple tremble with anger. When Veritaserum was mentioned, Fudge's expression turned grim. The trial hung in a deadlock. Scott's brows stayed tightly furrowed. The threats from B and Mr. Carrot's sudden accusations had come one after another. He did not believe this twist was unrelated to B. Was B connected to the Death Eaters and helping Mr. Carrot, or was he using the case to threaten Scott? Intuition told him the latter was more likely. The Book of Prometheus in Scott's hand vibrated several times. Pretending to look around casually to see if anyone was watching, he lowered his head and opened it again. A message scrolled through. Child, are you thinking they have no evidence to identify you as the hidden poison wizard? You're right, they have no evidence. Neither do I. But that does not stop them from pinning the poisoning of several wizards, including Caitlin Roll, on you. Want to try? Scott stared at the threat, then slowly exhaled. He closed the book, transformed it into a card, and slipped it into the lining pocket of his robe. He would not be cowed by threats. He would see how they planned to frame him. Raising his head, he scanned the courtroom. He still believed B was likely in the room. Fudge, presiding again, declared the use of Veritaserum inappropriate for these trial procedures. Because you cannot produce conclusive evidence, your testimony will not carry legal weight, he told Karkaroff and Miss Friedrich. Mr. Carrot protested loudly. We'll voluntarily undergo Veritaserum. That's according to procedure. Protest invalid, Fudge responded, stern. Electo Caro, a burly, ugly witch in the gallery, stood up. Principal, there's no proof Elijah killed Caitlin. Mr. Roll then rose, grief-stricken. We have another witness, Healer Melian Slaughter from St. Mungo's. Electo's face registered surprise. Fudge called for Miss Slaughter to be summoned. A witch in a green healer's dress, gentle as water and with an unmistakably maternal air, hurried into the courtroom. Mr. Roll said through his sorrow that after Caitlin returned home, he had privately asked Miss Slaughter to examine her. No one else knew. Fudge asked Miss Slaughter to state her findings. She did so softly. Principal, my detailed examination concluded that Ms. Roll died from an Avada Kedavra. And a detailed analysis of the residual magic shows the source of that killing curse was the defendant, Elijah Carrot. She produced a document and handed it up. This bears the official seal of St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. Electo Caro screamed, You're lying. Elijah is underage. He couldn't possibly cast Avada Kedavra. Miss Friedrich examined Caitlin too and found poison in her mouth. Silence, Fudge demanded in displeasure. Escort this woman who keeps disrupting the proceedings out. Two aurors in uniform burst in, moved quickly to Electo, and forced her from the courtroom. She did not try to resist. She only glared vindictively at Fudge and Miss Slaughter as she was led away. Silence fell once more. Fudge took the document, flipped through it, then announced gravely that the report from St. Mungo's was legally binding. Miss Slaughter added, there was poison in Miss Roll's mouth. Her blood contained traces of poisonous components, but those poisons were not ingested while she was alive. Impossible, Mr. Carrot, bound to his chair with chains, suddenly thrashed and shouted. I didn't kill her. Caitlin died of poisoning. The murderer is the hidden poison wizard. Trollop, I'll take the Veritaserum. Karkaroff and Miss Friedrich looked furious. Their memories had been altered, and they believed their testimony to be true. Fudge, clearly annoyed by Mr. Carrot's outburst, commanded, Control him. The earlier aurors returned, seized Mr. Carrot's shoulders, and sealed his mouth with a charm. Fudge shook the St. Mungo's report for emphasis. Everything Miss Slaughter has said is true. He passed the document to Bones. Moreover, Fudge continued, although your accusation against an innocent student cannot be established, you have admitted to sneaking into Hogwarts and attacking another person. He rose and spoke loudly. In my opinion, this trial can conclude. The charges this court brought against Elijah Jaden Carrot are established. He addressed the other Wizengamot members. The defendant has severely broken multiple laws. I propose life imprisonment in Azkaban. The report circulated among the Wizengamot. Scott watched Fudge's rapid, decisive moves with mounting surprise. The appearance of a St. Mungo's report had turned the case quickly in Fudge's favor. Perhaps it was the force of Fudge's will, but in any case, the little card in Scott's pocket, the Scholar Alliance identity card, had gone still. After all 50 members read the report, Fudge called a vote. 29 of the 50 raised their hands to agree with Fudge. Bones and Dumbledore also voted in favor. By majority rule, Mr. Carrot was sentenced to life in Azkaban. The trial was over. Since Electo Carrow had been removed, the wizards connected to Mr. Carrot no longer openly objected. Scott felt utterly unreal. This had been no proper legal trial, but a display of wizardly power. He had come to testify, and in the end, his testimony wasn't needed. Some of the spectators began to leave. Scott stayed put, watching two Aurors escort Mr. Carrot away. Though gagged, Mr. Carrot kept staring at Scott with venom in his eyes, twisting his neck stubbornly to keep him in sight until he disappeared through the door. Scott met his gaze until he was gone. A wizard resembling Electo Carrow stopped in front of Scott's seat. With his back to the crowd, he gave Scott a feral look. "You got lucky this time, you poor mudblood," he said in a sinister voice. "If Dumbledore hadn't been here..." He let the threat hang, revealed a cruel smile, and then turned and left. 392. What happened after the trial? Scott sat on the bench and watched the wizard who had threatened him stalk out of the courtroom. After a long moment, he turned his head and saw Milton's father walking toward him. Out of politeness, he stood and greeted him. "Hello, Mr. Greaves." "Hello." Mr. Greaves smiled kindly and sat on the bench beside him. "You're Scott, aren't you? Sit down." He put on a very friendly manner. "Yes." Scott sat. "You and Milton are good friends, aren't you?" Mr. Greaves said. "That's right. Milton is my good friend," Scott answered, surprised. "Of course." Mr. Greaves went on. "I mean, he used to talk of you often." Scott blinked, unsure why Mr. Greaves had come over to say that. He forced an awkward smile, which Mr. Greaves didn't notice. Then Mr. Greaves asked in a concerned tone, "Are you all right? The man who spoke to you a moment ago was Amicus Carrow. He's the uncle of the accused, Elijah Carrow." "I'm fine," Scott said. "This is the Ministry of Magic, and Professor Dumbledore is here. He wouldn't dare do anything." "That's good." Mr. Greaves nodded, then leaned in and lowered his voice. Amicus and Electo Carrow were both notorious Death Eaters. They only avoided Azkaban by inventing lies. He sat up, patted Scott's shoulder, and added, "Be careful, especially when you leave Hogwarts for the holidays." "Thank you for the warning," Scott said appreciatively. Mr. Greaves unbent again. This trial was strange. Even Minister Fudge didn't expect the second half to go so smoothly. Scott agreed inwardly. The Wizengamot had convicted Elijah Carrow, but something about the whole thing felt off. The prosecution had seemed to start strong and then fizzle. The Carrows' accusations and the threatening letters had ultimately amounted to nothing, leaving Scott with a pile of unanswered questions. He was about to ask about Milton when Mr. Greaves spoke casually. "How is Milton?" "He's well," Scott said formally. "That's good." Mr. Greaves smiled in a way that made him seem like any other father. Scott was left with another nagging thought. He got what he wanted, didn't he? Mr. Greaves lowered his voice further. "Tell him from me to follow the path he wants to take." Before Scott could show surprise, Mr. Greaves patted his shoulder again, stood, and walked away from the public gallery. Scott watched him cross to Minister Fudge, speak quietly, and then merge into a group of Wizengamot members. 50 members clustered below, split into clear factions, one around Fudge and Mr. Greaves, another around Dumbledore and Bones, and the rest in smaller groups. Scott wondered how Mr. Greaves could know about Milton's regained musical talent. Perhaps Medea, who had presided over the vow, had sensed it. Mr. Greaves' attitude hinted he cared more about Milton than he let on. Milton's family history might hide something. As he brooded, Dumbledore emerged from the crowd and waved. Scott quickly rose and jogged over. "Professor, are we going back now?" Dumbledore nodded and led him out of the courtroom. Once outside, his Wizengamot robes became the star-patterned robes of the Hogwarts headmaster again. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I saw two gentlemen speaking with you." Scott stepped closer and quietly told Dumbledore what Amicus Carrow and Mr. Greaves had said. "Mr. Greaves is right," Dumbledore said. "The Carrow siblings were and are vicious Death Eaters." "I'll be careful," Scott said. Dumbledore sighed. "The situation is not good. After the summer holiday, Phileas will escort you home again, just as he did last summer." Scott nodded. After a moment, he said, "I heard you refused the position of Minister for Magic. The Ministry could use someone like you." Dumbledore shook his head. "I am old and not enough would support me." Scott understood. Without a proper election, even Dumbledore's prestige might not be enough. Dumbledore's expression turned curious. "What did you make of today's trial?" Scott answered plainly. "It showed how broken the Ministry is. It's almost failing to do its job." "Yes," Dumbledore sighed. "Even a young wizard can see it." They went down from the 10th basement to the 9th and walked through a dim corridor to an elevator. A pale-faced wizard with a worried look stepped out and greeted Dumbledore mournfully. "Good morning, Albus. Has the trial ended?" "It has," Dumbledore replied. The wizard, Broderick Bode, asked about the outcome, then left. Scott noticed Bode look back at him as he entered the lift, forcing a sorrowful, friendly smile as their eyes met. When they emerged into the spacious atrium, Dumbledore began to explain the Department of Mysteries. No one knows precisely what they do. Their work is top secret. The wizards there are called unspeakables. They study forms of magic that are difficult, perhaps impossible, to truly control. Dumbledore's voice dropped even lower as they approached the fireplaces. "The department is divided into many rooms. The brain room studies thought. The death chamber studies death. The time room studies time. The planet room studies the cosmos, and the hall of prophecy stores prophecies. There is a special room, always locked, containing a power more magical and terrible than death, human intellect, or the forces of nature. It is the most mysterious subject there. Many people are full of it, others have none. That energy is love." He chuckled, stepped into the green flames, and announced Hogwarts Headmaster's office. Scott followed to the office. "There's still some time before lunch," Dumbledore said, taking his seat and beckoning Scott to join him for tea. Scott accepted the cup that appeared and sipped. Dumbledore asked casually, "Any other thoughts about the trial?" Scott leaned forward. "I suspect Voldemort and the Death Eaters are planning a breakout from Azkaban." Dumbledore looked interested. Scott continued, "The recent attacks are clearly their work. With a powerful opponent like Medea coveting him, and Voldemort not yet fully recovered, he wouldn't risk these acts just to cause panic. He's taking risks to regain power quickly. Medea seems to have the upper hand now, but many loyal Death Eaters are still in Azkaban. If Voldemort regains his strength, he won't give up the power he considers his. The Carrow siblings, knowing of a possible breakout, may have chosen not to push too hard in court." "A reasonable theory," Dumbledore said. Scott pressed on. "If it were me, I'd do what Medea could also consider. She's lost the initiative. She failed to stop Voldemort before he recovered. If she can't find him, she should keep a close watch on Azkaban. If things continue, there'll be a war between the Death Eaters and the full force of the wizarding community at Azkaban. If I were in command, I'd see this as an opportunity. Both sides are weakened. The best place to fight would be Azkaban. There aren't any innocents there to get caught in the middle." Dumbledore was silent for a beat. "What a ruthless plan," one of the portraits muttered. "But I like it," the bald head in another frame declared, approvingly. All the former headmaster's portraits had turned to look. Some favored Scott's words, others disapproved. Scott didn't care. He had been honest and didn't intend to pretend otherwise to please anyone. Dumbledore said nothing more about the plan. He reverted to his usual cheer and chatted with Scott until it was time for lunch. Scott left the office and went straight to the Great Hall to meet his roommates. As soon as they saw him, Eddie, Roger, and Milton pulled him into an empty corner, eager for news. "Scott, is the trial over? What happened?" Eddie asked. "Was Carrow sent to Azkaban?" Roger chimed in. It's over, Scott said with a smile. Elijah Caro was sentenced to life imprisonment. Great. He deserved it. Eddie and Roger cheered. Milton smiled, relieved. So you won't have to worry about him anymore, he said. Scott looked at Milton and remembered Mr. Greaves's words. Quietly, he told Milton what had been said. Milton's expression shifted into something complicated and incredulous. Scott nodded, and Milton murmured, "So he still cares about me." His eyes went red. Tears spilled down his face. 393. Target 1 and kill 3. After listening to Scott's account, Milton was dazed for the rest of the afternoon. He made frequent mistakes in potions and lost 5 house points when Snape marked him down. Scott didn't know how to comfort him. At dinner, Roger noticed Milton was still unsettled and suggested, "Maybe you should talk to your father." Milton simply shook his head. "He told me himself he hopes I don't go back," he whispered. "There might be reasons I don't understand, but if that's what he wants, I'll do it." Scott studied him and realized Milton wasn't speaking in anger. A faint smile crossed Milton's face, as if he were coming back to himself. "If he still cares about me, maybe listening is the right thing to do." "You could be right," Scott said. Milton's family was an up-and-coming wizarding household, and his temperament had always clashed with his relatives. With the added complications of a manipulative Mrs. Zabini and Medea pulling strings behind the scenes, things were even more tangled. Escaping those constraints might be a blessing in itself. Perhaps Mr. Greaves had advised Milton not to go home for the same reason. After dinner, Scott said goodbye to his roommates and went to Professor Flitwick's office for dueling practice. Flitwick already knew the day's events and first gave Scott a gentle, encouraging word. "Don't let slander and malice get to you. You've always been an excellent student, and don't lose faith in the wizarding world. We must believe that most wizards have justice in their hearts." Grateful but inwardly conflicted, Scott accepted the comfort. He would not, under any circumstances, reveal that he was truly a hidden poison wizard. Once practice began, Scott's fully formed Patronus charm surprised Flitwick. Flitwick beamed. "You should speak to Albus about more advanced uses. After all, he promised you." Scott thought of Dumbledore's speaking Patronus and how it had once blocked a Cruciatus. Flitwick explained further. "The basic Patronus repels Dementors, but the charm's function isn't limited to that. Though a Patronus has no physical body and can't stop physical attacks, it protects the mind, indeed the soul. Defending against a Cruciatus with a Patronus is something only Albus has shown to achieve. Generally, the unforgivable curses are irresistible. That said, Caro's horrible, clumsy use of the Cruciatus in your trial was low-powered." Scott asked, "Could Dumbledore defend against Avada Kedavra?" Flitwick shook his head. "No, not against a properly cast killing curse, unless the caster's magic is exceptionally weak." Flitwick also suggested Scott prepare to learn animagus work under Professor McGonagall. Scott agreed. The prerequisites were tedious and required luck, especially the first step, holding a single mandrake leaf in the mouth continuously from full moon to full moon without swallowing or removing it. If the leaf leaves the mouth at any point, the month has to be started again. Scott shuddered at the thought of speaking, eating, or washing with a leaf in his mouth for a month. After practice, he went to bed early. By 5 a.m. the next morning, he was up and, after dressing, used the port key in the deserted lavatory to reach Raven territory. From there, he rode his broom to Oak Cottage. Lambo flew up from a nearby nest. Scott entered the small cottage, took out a picture frame, and used Transfiguration to produce 3 portraits in rapid succession. "Remember these 3, he said, pointing. Amicus Caro and Electo Caro, twins and Death Eaters, and Broderick Bode, who works in the Department of Mysteries." Lambo cocked his head at the portraits. "What do you want me to do?" Scott considered. "Don't worry about the Caro twins for now. They'll be Voldemort's accomplices in any prison break. I want to know if Bode is the bee who wrote the threatening letter in the Book of Prometheus." "Bode? Do you want me to watch him?" Lambo asked. "Hold on." Scott went to a small desk and pulled a piece of ebony from his deformed lizard skin pouch. He set it down, calmed himself, and with a few precise wand movements, transformed the wood into a dusty-colored gecko. Lambo hopped up onto the table, curious. "Why didn't you bring that bone before you used magic?" it asked. Because Oak Cottage is hidden under a Fidelius charm, Scott replied. This is a safe house. The Ministry's trace can't detect underage magic used here. Lambo nodded, then asked, What's this little thing for? Scott smiled and took out his magic mirror. He drew a silver thread from the gecko's body into the mirror with his wand, then tapped the mirror. An image and sound played, exactly what the gecko had just seen and heard. It records images and audio, he explained. I can't make it feed live into the mirror yet. Only after I recover more of the mirror's function can I retrieve recordings remotely. This small gecko marked a major step in Scott's transfiguration ability. Previously, he would have had to carve runic circuits into the wooden form first, then cast transfiguration. Now he could integrate both in one operation. The progress represented nights of study under prophecy's pressure. Lambo didn't grasp the technical difficulty, but acknowledged it. Should I put it near Bode? It asked. 9th level underground, Department of Mysteries, Scott said. There are research halls and an office there. We'd have to risk sneaking into the Ministry and placing the gecko in that office. No problem, Lambo said confidently. I've been into the Ministry before. It's chaotic and I'm fast. But not the 9th level, Scott objected. You can only reach it by elevator. The Department of Mysteries has few staff. It's risky. To be safe, I could disguise a raven with a disillusionment charm. My charm on a raven can last at least 3 hours. Lambo shook its head. Even the cleverest raven isn't that clever. I won't be in danger. Scott thought it over and agreed. Lambo could fly silently and at extreme speed, perfect for slipping past guards. Be careful, Scott warned. If Bode is the one who threatened me, he could be dangerous. I understand. Lambo took the gecko in its claws. Scott reminded it to meet at Hogwarts afterward and cast a disillusionment charm on the bird. Lambo blended into the surroundings and then said, That won't work. What won't? Scott asked. The gecko. Lambo's voice was calm. It can't be charmed the same way. Scott looked at the little gecko now quivering in midair. I can't cast another charm on it, he explained. It's already integrated transfiguration with magical circuits. Adding another charm would destabilize it, might destroy it. Lambo shrugged and tucked the gecko away into its throat. I'll spit it out when it's time, it promised. Scott was a little anxious, but he forced a reassuring smile. Then Lambo left Oak Cottage, and Scott rode his broom back to Hogwarts in time for breakfast. At lunch, Scott left the room of requirement, and Lambo arrived from London, flying in smoothly. Seeing it safe, Scott let out a small breath. Lambo whispered, Everything went smoothly. It's the weekend. Few Ministry staff are on duty. Bode isn't in today. The gecko slithered through a door crack and into his office. Good, Scott whispered back. There's another job. They moved to a window at the corridor's end. You need to go to Azkaban, Scott instructed softly. Kill Elijah Caro and the old Yaxley, father and son. Same method? Lambo asked. Scott shook his head. No, for safety, no poisons this time. He didn't want to reuse a method that might leave unforeseen traces, nor did he want to risk letting the letter writer's threat loom larger. Scott produced a tiny black bird cage from his pocket, no bigger than a thumb. Inside was a writhing flock of black birds, miniature as midges. This is a new weapon, he said almost inaudibly. Transfiguration plus the shrinking charm. The raw material was hard steel. Lambo peered closer. How should I do it? My claws can tear a wizard's throat straight through. Scott knew Lambo's beak and talons were sharp, transformed from titanium alloy, but he didn't want direct wounds that could be forensically read. That would leave traces. I prefer something untraceable. Put the shrunken ravens into the target's cells. They'll crawl in through the mouth or nose. When the shrinking charm wears off, they'll return to full size inside and break out through the body cavity. I've timed the charm and the transfiguration duration. Once they expand, they'll fly away. In the end, they'll revert to steel blocks and fall into the sea. Scott's face was cold as he described it. Lambo nodded. Do you want them not to look like ravens? You've already used ravens publicly. They're common enough, Scott said. Azkaban has ravens coming and going. Only Dementors and ravens are frequent there. The guards stay on the perimeter because of Dementors. By the time anyone notices, the ravens will be gone. Lambo accepted the cage and flew out the window, the tiny birds tucked in its claws. Scott watched its silhouette disappear into the horizon and waited for tomorrow's paper. It wasn't impatience that drove him. The moment was fleeting. Azkaban was about to become tense. Dumbledore and he had agreed Voldemort would surely try a breakout. The longer he waited, the more eyes would be on the prison, and what he planned would be far harder. On Sunday morning, Scott woke before dawn. He slipped from his bed while the rest of the dormitory still slept and went down to the common room. A little while later, Lambo arrived, flying in through the owl post passage. Scott cast a soundproofing charm, sat on the sofa by the window, and watched the little creature settle beside him. Everything went smoothly, Lambo reported. I saw those 3 targets die myself. It shook its head as it spoke. I have to say, it was a bit disgusting. Scott frowned. You shouldn't have lingered there. That only increases the risk of exposure. Lambo waved off his concern. I flew high going in and out of Azkaban, it said. Dementors are blind, and the wizards guarding the island didn't notice me. What about the other prisoners? Scott asked. Most of them were half dead from the Dementors. Many were already mad. The cells were pitch black. I kept to the shadows and didn't make a sound. No one should have seen me. Lambo's tone was matter of fact. Scott nodded. Good work. Next time, be even more careful. Understood, Lambo replied. Then it cocked its head. But I still wanted to see exactly how you did it. Scott smiled and reached into his bag for the magic mirror he carried. I learned a little alchemy from the Ravenclaw mentor yesterday, he said. So I modified this mirror. He tapped his wand against Lambo's head and murmured, It won't let you relive memories like a pensieve, but it can convert memories into images. Lambo, being Scott's creation, didn't resist. It cooperated. The connection between them made the extraction simple. Lambo's memories were, after all, artfully constructed, and the partner contract between them was part of that construct. Scott closed his eyes, felt the link to the creature, and drew forth a silver thread of memory with his wand. He laid the thread on the mirror's surface and watched it sink. An hourglass pattern appeared on the glass. When the last grain of sand fell, an image resolved, Lambo's first-person view, high among the clouds. Scott tapped the mirror to speed the playback. The camera dropped fast, cutting down to a vast frozen sea and a black island rising alone from the water. He had seen Azkaban in books, but this was his first real view. A tall black castle on a desolate island, Dementors drifting around it like drifting smoke, their tattered cloaks trailing black mist. Lambo flew among them without touching them, swooping near faces hooded and rotten, scabbed hands reaching through the air. The creatures had no ordinary senses, only the perception of human emotion, so Lambo passed safely. The image followed it into the castle's great triangular opening and plunged into darkness. Lambo threaded its way through a honeycomb of cramped, gloomy cells from which the mutterings and screams of prisoners leaked. It hovered at narrow stone windows, peering in. Most inmates were little more than skeletons, either gesturing madly or curled in silent heaps. In Azkaban, Lambo said from Scott's shoulder, watching the mirror, the ones who still make sounds are either newly arrived or completely insane. Mostly insane. The memory showed Lambo moving cautiously through the corridors. Finding their targets wasn't instant. The creature had to listen and search. Finally, guided by the Dementor's attraction to strong emotions, it reached Caro's cell. Caro, Elijah Caro, had been thrown in on Friday. He hadn't been completely drained. A crowd of Dementors loitered nearby. Lambo slipped past them and hovered at the little window. Inside, the proud man who had once swaggered around Hogwarts now huddled in a corner, head between his knees, arms wrapped around his shins, trembling. Go away, he muttered. I didn't kill anyone. I was framed. Scott felt a small, cold satisfaction. Looks like the memory rewrite didn't stick, he said, watching the cringing figure. He still thinks he was unjustly imprisoned. He studied the pathetic sight and let the thought come. If he weren't worried Voldemort might try to break him out, he would have loved to watch such enemies suffer forever. Lambo kept searching and found the Yaxleys, father and son, in nearby cells. Once the locations were confirmed, it set its plan in motion. The playback darkened and blurred as Lambo darted into 3 cells in quick succession. The birdcage it carried was small and the light poor, so Scott couldn't make out every move. He heard coughing, choked and hoarse from each cell. Lambeau then stopped on an iron rack in a corridor and waited. Scott sped up the playback and then slowed it. A new howl filled the mirror. The Dementors around Caro's cell became agitated. Inside, Caro writhed and screamed. Scott muttered softly, "Professor Snape was right. Revenge tastes damn sweet." Lambeau's voice from his shoulder sniffed, "I don't think Snape would put it that way." Caro's stomach swelled grotesquely, like a woman in labor. Then, bang, his body burst as if a balloon had exploded. Scott turned his face away for a second. It was indeed revolting. A flapping sound followed as several pitch-black, blood-flecked crows squeezed through the narrow window and streamed into the castle's dark passages. Crows also burst from the other two cells. Lambeau used the dimness to inspect the other deaths before leaving. Some prisoners with a scrap of sanity began to shout, and Lambeau climbed out through the great opening and shot into the sky. The image froze. Back in the room, Lambeau hopped to Scott's hand. "I threw the cage into the sea," it said. "Well done," Scott praised. He understood now how Lambeau could enter and leave unnoticed. Azkaban's environment made it almost like a deserted place. "Anything else you need from me?" "Only Mr. Bode's gecko," Scott said. "That's your job next weekend." Lambeau wrinkled its face. "But the office will be locked. I can't get in through a door crack like that gecko." Scott smiled. "The gecko will crawl out Friday night and hide in the brick crack under the first torch to the left of the office door." "That makes it easier," Lambeau agreed. "Then I'll go Friday night." Scott dispelled the charm, opened the window, and watched the creature fly into the trees. He tapped the mirror a few times to wipe the recording clean, put it away, and pulled out his Scholar Alliance ID. With a little infusing of magic, he transformed it into the Book of Prometheus. He opened to the messages from Mr. B. After the trial on Friday, Mr. B had fallen silent. It felt almost as if his threats had been a joke. Scott frowned, but then used some of his academic credits to buy more information on animagus transformation. Animagus was an exceptionally complex, advanced transfiguration. Scott was confident in his progress, but wanted every practical insight he could get: how to prevent the animal form from swallowing the human mind, and how to revert safely. One account in the notes came from a Russian wizard who, after transforming into a brown bear, had apparently lost himself and nearly mated with a female bear before snapping back. Alarmingly close, but the report still contained useful techniques. Scott felt his credits were well spent. The others began to get up for the day and the common room emptied. Scott spent the day in the room of requirement, working and reading, until dinner. That night, the Evening Prophet carried the story of the deaths of Elijah Caro and the Yaxleys. The article caused a stir in the Great Hall. Caro had once been a Hogwarts student. Many recognized the name. Even knowing he'd been in Azkaban, the brutal nature of his death shocked people, especially the Slytherins who had known him. At the Ravenclaw table, Eddie asked quietly, "Do you think the Roar family did it?" "I think so," Roger answered, face tight. "The article didn't print photos, but you can imagine how awful it was." Milton was skeptical. If the Roars were behind it, why kill the two Alexas? "Maybe it was a glamour," Eddie suggested. "Some sort of smoke charm." Overhearing them, Scott listened. Most students assumed it was revenge by the Roar family. How else could someone reach Azkaban? Theories flew: bribed guards, ministry inside help, a peculiar curse. Fred and George, from across the hall, were louder than most. "I support the curse theory," Fred announced. "It's called the gut-busting curse," George intoned gravely. "Make a curse doll, feed it the target's blood, tear open the doll's belly, and the target's belly rips open too." The twins entertained a crowd and then claimed they had an amulet to guard against it, on sale. Young Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs bought the fiction at once. Eddie watched the twins profit with wide eyes and nudged the younger Ravenclaws. "Don't even think about it. I'm a prefect." "If you want to be prefect next year," Scott added, "remember, some things cannot be done." Eddie clutched his chest in mock woundedness. Scott, Roger, and Milton ignored the noise. Then Luna slid from the other side of the long table and came up behind Scott. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Come with me." She took his sleeve and tugged. He hesitated, then stood with her. Luna ignored the whistles and teasing laughs as they left the great hall. She held onto his sleeve until they reached the castle's back garden, then climbed onto a flower bed and stared down at him with pale gray eyes that seemed a touch too large for her face. She smoothed her hair, took down the wand tucked behind her ear, and with awkward, precise movements cast a short anti-eavesdropping charm. Her voice was soft. "I can see it," she said. Scott looked at the way something like a mist swam in her eyes and understood she'd seen more than surface details. "Of course," he said, "few people see more clearly than you." Luna nodded. Her expression was distant but clear in its way. She looked like someone whose mind sometimes wandered to other patterns than everyone else's. Scott watched her, patient. After a long pause, she asked hesitantly, "Are we friends?" "Of course," Scott said. "We are friends." She continued, still unsure. "No matter what I say, you won't get angry? Or even if you get angry, you'll still be my friend?" "Not a question you usually ask," Scott said, more surprised than annoyed. He nodded. "I won't get angry, and even if I do, I'll still be your friend." A faint smile flickered across Luna's face. Scott encouraged her. "Say what you need to say." She looked up at the dark sky, arranging her words. "I haven't known exactly what you've done," she said, "and I don't think you did anything wrong." Her voice drifted like she was telling two truths at once. "But today, when I was reading the newspaper, the rack spurts in my head told me something, and then I saw you, and I thought I should talk to you." Her meaning came in fragments and riddles, as Luna's words often did. Scott pressed gently. "You saw me in the newspaper? You can see causal lines?" Luna blinked, puzzled. Scott shook his head. He hadn't meant to make it sound grander than it was. Whatever had led her to him, she had connected him to the story, and that was enough. "Do you think I did something wrong?" he asked her directly. "I don't know," she confessed. "I want to say you did wrong. I don't like revenge. Your personality is so different from mine, I can see that. But I can't ask everyone to be like me." She looked troubled. Scott answered matter-of-factly. "You're tolerant. I'm not. If someone wants to take my life, they put theirs on the table. I don't gamble willingly, but if I have to, when I win, I take everything." Luna's face showed confusion. Scott leaned forward and looked into her gray eyes, testing. If she decided to tell anyone what she'd seen, if she chose to speak, he didn't mean to let her come to harm. But he would see she was made to be silent. He had ways to make sure she couldn't betray him, a binding, a contract that would keep her mouth shut. He didn't say it aloud. He only thought it, and his gaze hardened for a moment as the thought passed through him. 395. Luna wants to be an accomplice. Scott looked at Luna, waiting to see what she would choose. After a moment's thought, she surprised him by asking, "What would you do?" Her eyes were curious. "I know you wouldn't want me to tell anyone about what you've done." Scott wasn't astonished by the question. He answered honestly, "I'll bind you with a contract. You'll be sworn to secrecy." Luna didn't reply at once. She stared at him for a long beat, then nodded. "Okay, I'll sign." A flicker of surprise crossed Scott's face. Luna smiled faintly, a little pleased with herself. "But the contract should be mutual," she said. "I can promise not to tell anyone, but you have to accept my condition." Scott raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Luna grew serious. "You mustn't lie to me." Scott was taken aback. "You mean if I stop lying to you, you won't tell anyone what I've done, past or future?" She nodded. "Yes." "That's not fair," Scott said, looking into her clear eyes. "That actually benefits me." Luna cocked her head. "Does it matter? You said we're friends." Scott's tone went softer. "But are you the kind of friend who'll indulge me?" "I'm not," Luna said. "So I'll be watching you." Scott laughed. "That means whatever I did before stays in the past, and you can't stop me from doing things in the future, nor can you tell anyone." Luna nodded again. "I know," Scott admitted. "I can't see why you'd choose this." Luna lowered her head, looked a little distressed, and spoke quietly. "Because I know I can't stop you, and I don't want to see you locked up in Azkaban for those things." She met his gaze, grave and earnest. "You said we're friends, and I can tell that you meant it." Then she reached out. Scott felt her warm, small hand close over 3 of his fingers. "If you can't lie to me, I'll know everything about you. If I can't stop you, I'll choose to be involved." Scott was moved by the seriousness in her face. Though he considered Luna a friend, he knew their ways of relating to people were different. Looking into her unguarded eyes, he felt ashamed and, at the same time, a headache coming on. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. Do you think becoming my accomplice will give me scruples? Luna, I've always thought you were clever. Luna's grip tightened. She smiled, faintly mischievous. You said we're friends, she said stubbornly. I don't think I've done anything stupid. Scott frowned. He didn't want to drag such a little girl into his affairs. Luna must have sensed his hesitation. She added quickly, Since we've agreed, you can't back out. She kept his eyes. I'm ready, and I've got your hand, so you can't trick me into signing something. All right, Scott said, unable to do anything else. I give up. Luna smiled. Scott could have forced the contract on her if he'd wanted. He could be ruthless when he needed to be, but faced with kindness, he couldn't repay it with cruelty. Especially facing such pure concern, he yielded. Then let's begin. Luna let go and watched expectantly. Scott produced a sheet of parchment from the battered lizard skin pouch at his waist and drew his wand. Writing flowed across the page, and when the full text appeared, he traced several complex golden sigils. When the runes dimmed, the parchment floated between them. The contract finished. If we sign our names with magic, Scott said, the contract takes effect. I'll go first. Luna lifted her wand without hesitation. Are you sure you don't want to think again? Scott asked. Luna waved her wand. A glittering script hung in the air. Luna Lovegood. The name spun and attached itself to the parchment. Scott followed with his wand. Scott Trollope appeared in the same shimmering ink. As both names solidified and darkened, the contract became binding. Luna rolled the parchment carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She hopped out of the flower bed and looked up at him. I'll keep it safe, she said. Scott shrugged. Fine by me. She skipped a few steps, then turned back to him. Now it's your turn to answer my question, she said. You can't lie. Scott warned. You know I could simply refuse to answer. That doesn't matter, Luna said, tapping her eyes. The little fellow who lives in my eye will tell me anyway. She blinked. Luna blinked like that sometimes, as if the world spoke back to her. Though it's a bit blurry, Scott slid his wand into the holster sewn inside his robe. All right, ask. Luna's expression became unusually solemn. About the thing in the newspaper, I want to know why you did it. I've told you before, Scott replied stiffly. They were trying to kill me. I want the details, she said. Do you really want me to hear it? Scott asked. Luna nodded. She had signed the contract. His conscience was clear. So Scott began. He told her how it started with Jacob. Jacob's misfortune drew Jasmine Travers into it. Jasmine bore a grudge against him, conspired with a house elf to kill him. Her death inflamed Caitlin Roll's hatred. The Yaxley family, eager to secure the Travers property, promised Jasmine's father they would take Scott's life. Elijah Caro's malice towards Scott came through Caitlin. Scott spoke without interruption. Luna sat and listened, her face changing in ways he knew meant she was overwhelmed. Mist gathered in her eyes, his old sign that she didn't quite know how to cope. Scott didn't hide the killings. He thought telling her everything might frighten her away. If she kept her distance, she couldn't tell anyone or meddle. Strange, he thought. That felt like the best outcome. He described almost everything that had happened to him over the past 2 years until the moon was high and cold in the sky. When he finished, Luna trembled slightly. She seemed dazed, lost in thought. Scott watched her, saying nothing. After a long while, the mist cleared from her eyes, and she looked back at him, steady. That was exhausting, she said softly. Scott's expression hardened on impulse. He'd expected horror, anger, maybe even disgust. Luna's voice remained gentle. If you had chosen differently at the beginning, would you have had a happier life? Scott hesitated, the bones of his face stiff. I don't know, he admitted. He couldn't tell whether sparing Jasmine Travers would have left fewer troubles or created more. She had been dangerous in her own way. Luna answered, I don't agree with your choice, Scott. It seems like an overreaction to me. But who can say I'm always right? Even I can't be sure. Scott laughed shortly. Of course you can choose to live by your own ideas. Can you? Luna asked. I always have, Scott said. Luna nodded. Me too. She smiled then, but her expression shifted. I almost convinced myself by your reasons, Scott, she said. But my father taught me that our eyes shouldn't only look for harm and pain. We shouldn't touch hatred carelessly. Do you think my eyes only see bad things? Scott asked. No, she replied. I can see there has always been love in your heart. The difference is, Scott said slowly, your tolerance and love can be given to many people. Mine can only be given to very few. He amused himself internally at how petty sounded almost noble when he put it that way. Luna seemed persuaded. What's wrong with that? She asked. I'm the same. My love for some people would never outweigh my love for my family. She shook her head as if to clear it. Oh, I can't quite explain this. I'll think about it and we'll talk later. Then, without another word, she wandered off, as if sleepwalking through her thoughts. Scott stood for a moment, watching her vanish into the flower beds. After a while, he left the gardens a different way. Near the exit, he met Grapeland, this time leading Fang, Hagrid's dog, rather than a Thestral. Evening, Scott, she said, smoke drifting from her lips. Fang whimpered, wanting to keep his distance. Good evening, Miss Grapeland, Scott replied, stopping. Her full red mouth curved. Anything you want to ask me, boy? Scott didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a grin. No, he said straight. Grapeland only glanced at him. It's fine. If you have questions, you can come to me. Really? Scott smiled. Of course, she nodded. Scott crouched and stroked Fang's coarse head. Although Fang looks fierce, he said casually, Professor Hagrid says he's a coward. Grapeland choked on her smoke. What do you mean by that? Nothing, Scott said, still patting Fang. I just thought of it and said it. Her smile tightened. She started to speak, then stopped. Mr. B? Scott put a finger to his lips and shushed her with a smile. Shh, I've already met Mr. B. Grapeland froze. Impossible. You don't even know who Mr. B is. Scott answered calmly. Mr. B isn't the only person in the Scholar Alliance. You, Grapeland's eyes narrowed. Who have you contacted? That's not your concern, Miss Grapeland. Scott let a little swagger into his voice. Grapeland stared at him for a long moment, then said with certainty, No, you're lying. Scott smiled and said nothing. Grapeland recovered her composure. You're just an underage wizard. Without Mr. B's backing, I can't recruit you to the Scholar Alliance. Besides Mr. B and me, no one else in the Alliance has noticed you, an underage wizard. You can't reach those people now. Scott blinked. Thanks, he said earnestly. Thanks for that useful information. Her surprise returned. Scott raised a finger. First, when I said I'd met Mr. B, your reaction interested me. Her face shifted. Scott tapped his finger again. You blurted that I don't know who Mr. B is, but you didn't say it was impossible that I'd meet him. That means, somewhere, you think I could meet him. Grapeland's expression turned rueful. Scott pressed on. I did meet someone on Friday at the ministry during that hearing. So what? Grapeland forced herself to sound casual. There were many people at the ministry that day. Indeed, Scott said, and let his eyes rest elsewhere. He had seen many faces that day. Very few were suspicious. There was only one name that might have matched, but he refrained from mentioning it. Painting specifics would risk exposing them both. Grapeland sighed, probably convinced she'd won. Scott raised another finger. Also, you didn't tell me everything about joining the Scholar Alliance. As my guarantor, Mr. B has the Book of Prometheus and more authority in the knowledge bank than I do, she said. She didn't look embarrassed now. He can even restrict my communications with other members. So you admit that? Grapeland nodded. I thought you'd already twigged to that. I didn't expect you hadn't tried to reach anyone else. Scott shrugged. He hadn't bothered. He didn't want a deep tie to the Scholar Alliance. Grapeland, unwilling to argue further, waved a hand. If you want more in the Alliance, contact Mr. B. If he approves, your own Book of Prometheus will gain more authority. She left then, leading the whimpering Fang away. Scott returned to the Ravenclaw common room to finish an essay. In the library, he saw Luna again. She was poring over a huge book, not looking as if she wanted to be disturbed. That evening, the common room buzzed. Many students, Eddie and Roger among them, were still talking about the bombshell headline in the Evening Prophet. The Ravenclaws had split into factions. Some said it was the Roar family's revenge. Some blamed a dark wizard who enjoyed killing. Others thought an escapee from Azkaban, and a few even blamed Dementors. Scott sat and listened. Scott. Eddie, who had been arguing fiercely, came over. What do you think? He winked, hoping Scott would back him. Scott shook his head. Let's wait for the Auror's report. No one agreed. Their faith in the Aurors had already waned. What use are those Aurors? They've left too many cases unsolved. I won't trust them anymore. I was going to be an Auror, but I've changed my mind. Scott listened. Suddenly he realized several cold cases over the past 2 years, unsolved ones, might have been his work. He found himself silently apologizing to the Aurors. The conversation still went on when Milton, back from practicing piano, and Scott, both exhausted from study, sat quietly. Eddie, noticing their silence, changed tack. Elijah Caro's 2 followers aren't doing well, he said with dramatic relish. Those 2 who ambushed Scott on the viaduct. Scott pricked up. He remembered them. What happened to them? They were too close to Caro, like Malfoy's 2 thugs, Eddie said. After the news that Caro killed Roll spread in Slytherin, everyone shunned them. Milton blinked. Why would that affect them? Eddie shrugged. I don't know, but the Slytherins don't see it that way. Roger added flatly, Caitlin Roll was pure blood and engaged to Caro. Even so, Caro attacking his fiancée is monstrous, but it's not the followers' fault. Eddie frowned. Still, the Slytherins ostracized them because of it. 396. Luna brings a surprise. A new week arrived. After Monday dinner, before the Transfiguration Club began, Scott went to Professor McGonagall's office on his own. When he explained why he'd come, she did not look surprised. You've decided to prepare for the preliminary animagus ritual? He nodded. Given your mastery of human transfiguration, you can certainly begin preparations, she said. She paused, then added, Today's April 18th. There happens to be a full moon on the 25th. That would be an appropriate night to start the ritual. She rose from behind her desk, opened a cabinet, and took out a sealed glass vial. These are mandrake leaves from my collection. She handed the vial to Scott. You must keep the leaf in your mouth for an entire month. If it leaves your mouth or is damaged, you must start over. Scott accepted the vial and thanked her solemnly. Be careful, she warned again. The ritual must begin on a full moon. If you fail, you'll have to wait until the next month. Scott swallowed nervously. Professor, are there any tricks? It seems easy to fail while eating, washing, or sleeping. McGonagall shook her head. There are no tricks for this step. You must be careful yourself. I understand. Scott stared at the leaf inside the bottle. It looked fresh and fragile. McGonagall smiled and suggested, You have a week until the 25th. Practice this week with other leaves so you can get used to keeping something in your mouth. Scott accepted the advice. The next day, he began carrying a mint leaf with him constantly. It was harder than he expected. On the first day, he went through more than a dozen mint leaves. Speaking wasn't the problem. The trouble came when eating. He would bite or swallow the leaf by accident when drinking, rinsing his mouth, brushing his teeth, and worst of all, sneezing, which made him spit the leaf out without thinking. By the end of the day, he'd lost a lot of confidence. Unless I can avoid eating, drinking, or brushing my teeth, I've got almost no chance, he muttered. In the dormitory, he complained to his roommates. You can only manage not brushing your teeth, Eddie laughed. If you do that, stay away from us for a month. Scott put another mint leaf in his mouth and mumbled, Now I want to find out if I swallow it in my sleep. Roger looked sympathetically. This is too much trouble. No wonder so few wizards ever become animagi. But Scott has to try, Milton said. He's got the talent. Eddie crowed. Yes, go on, don't waste it. Scott ignored him and went to bed. In the morning, the mint leaf was stuck to his pillow. He cast a vanishing charm on the gross remnant and tried brushing his teeth with a leaf in his mouth again. This time he failed during the rinsing step. Eddie and Roger, delighted by his predicament, couldn't stop laughing. At breakfast, they watched him like hawks. Scott ate with exaggerated caution. Every chew, every swallow was painstakingly measured, and it took him twice as long to finish. When he realized the leaf had survived breakfast intact, he sighed with relief. To avoid sneezing while speaking, he wore a mask after breakfast and resolved not to speak unless necessary. That day, he used up 7 mint leaves. Progress, at least. That night, he fashioned a crude chin strap from elastic fabric with strings hooked over his ears to keep his mouth closed while he slept. The contraption worked. On Thursday morning, the mint leaf was still in place. From then on, his life became a regimen of minimal speaking, careful eating and toothbrushing, a daytime mask, and the nightly anti-opening contraption. He used fewer leaves each day, 5 on Thursday, 4 on Friday, 2 on Saturday, and finally on Sunday, he kept a leaf in his mouth from morning until the next morning. Monday came. The 25th, the full moon. That night, after meticulously brushing and rinsing, Scott placed the mandrake leaf Professor McGonagall had given him into his mouth beneath the light of the full moon. He wore a mask and continued working on an essay in the common room when Luna approached and sat down beside him. "You don't need to speak, Scott," she said quietly. "I already know you're preparing for Animagus." Scott nodded. Luna moved a stool next to him and began her own homework. She looked at him, then smiled faintly. "I still don't understand everything. Some things may be meant to stay unsolved," she said, voice steady and serious. "But I will be watching you." She lowered her head and wrote. From that night on, Scott and Luna spent more time together. Different years and different classes made real study time limited, but she began sitting with him at meals, doing homework beside him, and sometimes waiting in the common room until he came back from Professor Flitwick's office before saying a few words and heading to sleep. She truly kept her promise. Their increasing closeness drew attention and gossip. "The Ravenclaw genius has fallen for the crazy girl," became a favorite rumor for a while. Neither Scott nor Luna cared. They kept their own pace and hardly noticed the whispers. Scott's friends asked once, and he simply said, "We're friends," which was true. Over time, even the others realized there wasn't any romance. Eddie, the gossip, teased Scott anyway. Scott, in turn, waved his wand and wrote 2 lines of glittering script in the air. Perhaps all the girls at Hogwarts who fit his aesthetic have already dated him. Eddie laughed and kept poking about Luna, but Scott left it there. To Scott, Luna was a clever child, brilliant in her own way, but still young. After learning from a prophecy who he would one day face, Scott had lost interest in romance. Luna, he felt, simply wasn't at that point yet. What worried him more was that Luna's position among the Ravenclaw girls seemed to have worsened. She had always been considered odd even by Ravenclaw standards. After Savannah dropped out, she lost the one female friend she'd had in-house. Now growing closer to Scott apparently increased the ostracism by other girls. Fortunately, her friendship with Ginny remained good. After Scott warned her once, Luna stopped letting others hide her things and learned to refuse. She seemed indifferent and unbothered by the social chill. One day while doing homework, Scott asked plainly, "Are you okay? There don't seem to be any girls in Ravenclaw who are friends with you." Luna did not seem surprised by the question. "I'm fine," she said. The answer wasn't forced. She genuinely didn't care. "It's because you're too popular," she added as if explaining an obvious fact. "Everyone wants to be friends with you." Scott shrugged. He didn't feel popular. Over the years, only Savannah had shown him romantic interest. He'd never made many friends. He usually kept to a few: Eddie, Milton, Roger, and the Weasley twins. "Older students wouldn't say I'm unapproachable," he offered slowly. "But yes, I rarely interact with younger ones." Luna nodded, then asked, "Do you have trouble? You new again?" Scott had grown used to Luna's uncanny awareness. He was indeed troubled. He'd rewatched the footage of Mr. Bode captured by Lambo's gecko many times without finding proof that Mr. Bode was the mysterious bee who'd been threatening him. Between the pressure of preparing the Animagus ritual and living so cautiously with a leaf in his mouth, he'd had little time or patience to comb through the recordings thoroughly. With no reason to hide anything from Luna, he told her the situation as concisely as he could. "Leave it to me," she said immediately. "I'll help you check it." Scott didn't expect much, but he didn't refuse. After showing her his Scholar Alliance identity card and the transformed form of the Book of Prometheus, he handed the magic mirror to her. He agreed to the help because he didn't want to disappoint her. What he didn't expect was the result. For the next week, Luna didn't bring it up. Then, on a Tuesday evening after dueling practice, Scott returned to the common room to find her sitting on the sofa, waving and holding his magic mirror. "I found something," she said, "a clue." It was after curfew and the common room was empty. Scott sat beside her, took the mirror, and watched the image. Luna had extracted a segment, a static frame of B standing in front of a messy bookshelf in his office, holding a large black book and about to turn away. Luna tapped the mirror. The image became a clip. B rose from behind his desk, walked to the disordered shelf, plucked the black book, and left. At first, Scott saw nothing unusual. He watched the clip several times. On the 5th playthrough, the flaw revealed itself. The shelf's book count did not change when B took the book. The scene allowed a pause and magnification. B had used his body to block the shelf as he reached out, but the number of books remained the same. The black book in his hand had appeared out of thin air. Luna pointed to another detail, the cuff of B's right sleeve. A faint golden shimmer at the edge of his black cuff was visible when magnified. It looked like a golden card. Scott realized then that this B, who so carefully maintained a private, reclusive persona, was also a member of the Scholar Alliance. Whether he was the one calling himself B remained unconfirmed, but it was a discovery. "Thank you, Luna," Scott said. He understood how much patience it must have taken to comb through the footage that way. "You're welcome. I'm glad I could help," she replied, smiling. Luna put her hand on his arm, and for a moment Scott saw genuine worry in her eyes. "What will you do?" she asked softly. "Right now, nothing," he said. "Nothing." She blinked. "I won't act for now," Scott repeated. Luna nodded and smiled as if she trusted him completely. "I believe you," she said, "because you can't lie to me." She didn't press him about why. She stood up, waved, and headed toward the girls' dormitory. "Good night, Scott," she called. "Good night, Luna," he answered. After she left, Scott looked back at the image in the mirror and studied B's movements again. He allowed himself a small, private smile. He suspected he'd identified the man behind the threats. To test the idea, he used arithmancy. Even with limited data, the discipline could suggest probabilities, and after one session, Scott's calculations strengthened his suspicion. He turned off the mirror and walked back to the dormitory. He had not lied to Luna. He really would do nothing, at least for now. B was an unspeakable, practiced at hiding and armed with unknown means. Rushing into a confrontation with such an opponent could have unpredictable consequences. Besides, so far the threats had been only words. If B possessed evidence that could truly harm him, Scott thought he would have already used it to try to coerce him. The earlier trial, where threats were accompanied by manipulated memories and empty accusations, had been all talk and no action. Scott wasn't desperate. He didn't need anything from them, and he didn't value the knowledge bank as they assumed. He had nothing to fear at present. He would wait, watch, and prepare. If B slipped up or revealed his true background, Scott would not be overly polite. For now, patience and caution were his strategy. For Scott, every day in May dragged on like a lifetime. He had to keep a mandrake leaf tucked in his mouth at all times and be constantly careful. On top of that, the month was taken up with gathering the other ingredients for the animagus potion, dew and the pupae of the death's head hawk moth. He'd ordered the pupae by mail without trouble. The dew was the problem. The dew he needed had to be taken from a spot that hadn't seen sunlight or human touch for 7 full days. Scott could only rely on Lambo and the Ravens to find such a place in the Forbidden Forest. He asked Lambo to lead them to a patch of vegetation that never received sunlight, then planned to collect the dew himself each morning. When he mentioned it, Luna volunteered to help. That morning, Scott woke while his roommates were still asleep, washed up carefully, and went down to the common room to meet her. "Good morning," he said. Luna came skipping down the stairs. "Good morning." Scott's eyes dropped to her bare feet under her robes. "You should put your shoes on," he said. Bare feet on the common room carpet didn't look like a good idea for the forest. Luna blinked, wiggled her toes, then tugged Scott's sleeve. "Let's go quickly." He insisted she dress properly. She ran back to her dormitory and reappeared in knee-high socks and little leather boots. Satisfied, Scott nodded, and the two left Ravenclaw Tower and headed toward the Forbidden Forest just before dawn. A thin mist still clung to the castle's back gardens. Scott wore a mask and kept mostly silent, while Luna wandered the paths happily, peering at flowers and looking for dew. Once they entered the Forbidden Forest, Lambo swooped down and took the lead. "Hello, Lambo," Luna said, introducing herself. "I'm Luna Lovegood." Lambo gave them a cursory glance and then looked to Scott. "Hello, Luna," he replied. Luna beamed. She clearly liked Lambo and chattered on as they walked. Lambo, at first reserved, warmed to her strange, cheerful questions. "Are you the king of the Raven territory?" and indulged her, puffing up with pride at being called a lord. Scott stayed out of their conversation. His magic sense told him no one else was nearby. He wasn't worried about Lambo speaking with them. After a few days of searching, the ravens found a tiny area in the forest that never received sunlight at this time of year, and that seemed seldom visited by humans. It wasn't large, and it took Scott and Luna the whole morning to collect only a small amount of dew, enough to moisten a lip if drank. But Scott needed only a silver teaspoonful. He produced 2 glass bottles from the little scaly lizard skin bag at his waist and handed one to Luna. "Be careful," he warned. "Dew touched by humans won't work." Luna nodded solemnly. They crouched and collected dew without touching it, pinching the base of a plant and shaking it so the beads rolled naturally into the bottles. They repeated the process at the same spot over 7 days, then again 2 more times as required. Before they left, Scott told Lambo, "Keep the ravens near this place. We'll come back in 7 days. 2 more collections should do it." "I hope the weather doesn't change," Luna fretted. "If it rains, the dew will be ruined, right?" Scott had no solution for that. The conditions for learning to become an animagus were unbearably particular, part of why the task depended on luck. Fortunately, luck held. They managed 2 more successful collections and gathered the necessary dew. The month passed with the mandrake leaf still snug in his mouth. As the full moon of May 25th drew near, Scott's anxiety turned to the weather. On the night of the full moon, he would have to remove the leaf, fill a small crystal vial with his saliva, immerse the leaf in it, and expose the vial to pure moonlight. If clouds hid the moon, he'd have to find a new mandrake leaf and start over, every last effort wasted. When the 25th arrived, Scott woke to continuous rain battering the windows. His stomach sank. His roommates, Eddie, Milton, and Roger, had known what he'd been doing, and their faces fell when they saw the weather. "Scott," Milton began and faltered. The common room grew quiet. Even Eddie, usually the loudest of the bunch, seemed at a loss. Roger walked over and gave Scott a firm pat on the shoulder. Scott, who'd learned to speak with minimal movement because of the leaf, managed a small, calm laugh. "I'm fine," he said. He had also learned to keep his mouth nearly closed while talking. His voice came out a little muffled. "Don't be sad," Eddie stammered. "You'll definitely succeed next time." Milton tried similarly without conviction. Roger cheered. "It's not time to give up." A moment later, Scott grinned and set them straight. "It doesn't matter if it rains here. Even if it's raining in the Highlands, it doesn't mean it's raining everywhere else." Eddie brightened. "Even if it's raining all over Britain, it's not raining everywhere." Roger laughed and added, "You can always find somewhere with moonlight tonight." Scott had already thought of that. He nodded and decided to ask Professor Flitwick for help. After washing and dressing as usual, he left the dormitory before the others and found Luna standing at a window watching the rain. "Even if it's raining at Hogwarts, you can find a place with moonlight," she told him. "I know," he said. He went straight to Professor Flitwick's office. The tiny charms professor looked up with a smile. "Oh, Scott, I was just thinking of you." He peered out the window at the rain and said, "If there's no moonlight here tonight, I'll take you somewhere that has it." "Thank you, Professor." Scott bowed. Flitwick waved him on with a warm smile. Professor McGonagall also sought Scott out during morning class. She only breathed when she learned his plan, adjusting her glasses. "I always thought you'd think of this," she said, "but I was worried you might throw away a month's work if you panicked." The rain persisted through the day. After dinner, Professor Flitwick returned. "I've checked. London is dry tonight," he reported. "We'll go there first." Scott agreed at once. They apparated from McGonagall's office to the Leaky Cauldron in Diagon Alley. Tom, the innkeeper, greeted Flitwick cheerfully, but the professor declined a drink. He hustled Scott through the crowd and, once outside, took his hand and apparated them both to a quiet copse of trees. "This will do," Flitwick said. "You know what to do." Scott drew a small crystal vial from his pocket and filled it with saliva. When it was nearly full, he finally removed the mandrake leaf from his mouth with a huge, grateful sigh. For the first time in a month, his jaw moved freely and he opened his mouth in exaggerated relief. He held the vial up to the moonlight so the saliva and the leaf bathed in it. The saliva cleared, the mandrake leaf unfurled and settled. He added the remaining ingredients he had prepared, a strand of his own hair, a teaspoon of the forbidden dew, and the death's head hawkmoth chrysalis. Under the moon's gaze, the mixture reacted, the components slowly dissolving until Scott was left with a small vial of cloudy, colorless potion. He sealed it with a cork and then wax. "Now bury it in a quiet, dark place," Flitwick said. "The ground is best." Scott tucked the vial into his little lizard skin bag, activated the silver snake-shaped portkey at his hip with a quick shake, and was transported back to the Raven territory. The highlands had stopped raining, but the sky remained overcast. No moonlight reached the forest. He drew a severed arm bone talisman, activated it, and then lit his wand. "Lumos," he whispered. Lambeau fluttered down from the oak above. "Are you finished?" Lambeau asked. "Good evening, Blackwing Lord," Scott teased. Lambeau laughed. "You shouldn't make me sound so grand. Call me Lambeau." Scott enlarged Lambeau with a small charm so the raven could carry him farther and had him fly to a bare cliff where nothing nested and no animals lived, quiet and undisturbed. He made a deep pit, buried the vial in the earth, and set a heavy stone over the spot, using a levitation charm to press it down. "That should keep it safe," he said. After clapping his hands, he climbed back on Lambeau's back and returned to the edge of the forbidden forest, then made his way to Hogwarts Castle alone. Back at the castle, he found Professor Flitwick to thank him properly, then slipped through the secret passage in the professor's office into the Ravenclaw common room. "How did it go?" Milton asked from where he'd been working on an essay. "Everything went smoothly." Scott smiled, his voice still a little muffled. "I keep feeling like there's still something in my mouth," he confessed, rubbing his face. "You'll need a thunderstorm to finish collecting the potion," Scott added. "And while I wait, I have to perform a little ritual at sunrise and sunset to feel my second heartbeat." He pulled out his wand, placed it lightly over his chest, and muttered, "Amato, animo, animato, animagus." Nothing dramatic happened, he explained to Milton. "You're supposed to do this at each sunrise and sunset until the storm, so I'll feel my second heartbeat." "Summer's coming," Milton said. "You won't have to wait long for a thunderstorm." Scott hoped so. He then found Luna in the Ravenclaw library to tell her everything had gone as planned. Animagus? Helena, floating over from somewhere in the stacks, had overheard. "There aren't many animagi in Ravenclaw," Helena said. "You'd best turn into an eagle, or a raven would be fitting." Scott grinned. "It's a peregrine falcon. My Patronus is a peregrine." "Excellent," Helena approved. Just then, Ethan Cooper walked in and called out, "Someone's looking for you. Fred and George are at the common room entrance." Scott thanked Ethan and went straight there. The twins lounged by a window, impossibly smug. "Hi, Scott," they chorused. "Guess why you've come to find me," Scott said, playing along. Fred and George announced with great ceremony that they had finished their promotional video for Gryffindor and needed help in post-production. They wanted to borrow Scott's small magic mirror for editing and a large one for public screenings. They also hinted, very secretly, that they'd like him to handle the actual editing, too. Scott raised an eyebrow but held out his hand for the footage. The twins, predictably, wouldn't play it straight. They clasped their hands together, declared the process had to remain secret until release, and then, in one smooth motion, hoisted Scott up and whisked him down the secret passage to Weasley's wizard wheezes. "Don't worry," Fred called as they hauled him off. "We'll pay you in fame and fudge." Scott laughed, letting himself be dragged along. If he had to be kidnapped into a prank shop, it might as well be for Gryffindor's sake. 398. This is Hogwarts, inside the joke shop's prop workshop. Scott skimmed the footage he'd imported into the magic mirror and then fell quiet. "Are you sure?" he asked, looking up at Fred and George. He estimated that about 60% of the clips showed the twins' pranks around Gryffindor. 20% was Quidditch, 10% featured the most famous wizard in the world, 5% was of the boy who lived, and the last 5% were earnest introductions to Gryffindor. The twins nodded decisively to his question. "Of course we are," they said. "Is there anything wrong with that?" George asked. "There's nothing wrong with it." Scott hedged. He paused. "But did it matter?" "As long as you're happy with it." He nodded and started the piece of music the twins had supplied. It was stirring and suitably heroic in that Gryffindor way, pleasant but a touch conventional. "Is this your secret weapon?" Scott asked, puzzled. "It's nice, but it's not on the level of Milton's impression of Ravenclaw." Fred and George beamed. This is our secret weapon. Scott blinked, listened again, and still couldn't hear anything especially outstanding. The puzzled look on his face must have been obvious because Fred cut to the chase. The composer is Professor McGonagall. No wonder it sounds so good, Scott said with a small smile. That really is a secret weapon. Performed by members of Gryffindor's classical music club, with vocals by the Toad Choir, George added proudly. Very good, Scott said. Once I get the structure and rhythm down, I'll start editing the footage. The music and the footage didn't exactly match, but together they had a kind of absurd humor that might work, an odd, memorable mashup. Scott muttered to himself that the twins probably hadn't shown Professor McGonagall the videos they'd filmed, or at least only a carefully chosen portion. You'd better not say that I helped with this, he warned. That was his only request. The video wouldn't take long to edit, but it wouldn't be instant either. We want to play it at the Leavers Feast, Fred announced. It was May 25th. The feast was still a couple of weeks away, with exams and a week of study in June. Scott wasn't busy during exam week, so he had time to do it carefully. Leavers Feast? Even at the planning stage, Scott felt a shiver of embarrassment for the other Gryffindor students, especially Ron and Percy, who featured heavily in the twins' pranks, and Harry, who'd been filmed secretly. He could already picture their faces. He shrugged it off. Amado, animo, animado, animagus, he whispered, practicing the ritual again the next morning. Standing at the dormitory window, its wand to his chest, he felt Milton's voice in his head. The Ministry of Magic strictly controls animagi. Any animagus transformations and characteristics must be registered with the Improper Use of Magic Office. I know, Scott replied, turning. When I succeed, I'll register. He didn't want to carry the risk of someone else having leverage over him, and after weighing the pros and cons, he decided to become a legal animagus. It meant losing the element of surprise, but the alternative, keeping it hidden forever, was neither practical nor safe. Let's go, Eddie urged, bouncing with excitement. Let's watch the birth of this year's Quidditch champion. What's the hurry? Roger grumbled, fussing over his hair in the mirror. Ravenclaw had slipped to third in the standings and could no longer contend for the championship. Slytherin sat in first and Gryffindor in second, only a hair behind. Roger felt deflated. Scott patted his shoulder. No one's blaming you, brother. Ravenclaw's lack of hard power could only be patched over so much with tactics and resolve. Roger had done everything he could, grueling training, forming advisory groups, but it wasn't enough. Scott meant it when he said there was no blame. When the four of them reached the Quidditch pitch, the stands were already full. Apart from the students and professors, parents and ministry officials had come. Dumbledore and Fudge sat in the center of the main stand, surrounded by ministry staff and student guardians. The Slytherin and Gryffindor parents clustered separately. Lucius Malfoy and Mr. Weasley were both conspicuous in the crowd. White hair on one side of the stadium, red on the other, glancing at each other with clear dislike. Using his panoramic telescope from his shape-shifting lizard skin bag, Scott scanned the main stand and the crowd. He noticed a few familiar faces. The Caro siblings, sitting a row behind Lucius, and tucked away in a less conspicuous corner, Mr. Bode. The Caros didn't see him peering, but Mr. Bode seemed sensitive to being observed and looked up in Scott's direction. Even through the telescope, Scott met the man's eyes. It seemed impossible that, among so many people holding instruments and scanning the pitch, Mr. Bode should have picked him out exactly, but the gaze had been unmistakable. Scott's intuition tightened. His deductions from arithmancy and other clues had pointed to this. Mr. Bode was B. The man had been watching and investigating him. He knew some of Scott's secrets and wanted him to be useful. What Bode ultimately wanted remained unclear, but Scott had never been one to dismiss a clear sign. Scott. Luna forced her way through the crowd and appeared at the back row. Luna? Scott lowered the telescope and reached out to pull her up. Why are you way back here? You'd see so much better in the front. I wanted to watch with you, she said simply. Eddie, who'd been sitting next to Scott, stood and offered his seat with a conspiratorial wink. Thank you, Luna said and settled in beside Scott. The game began. Cheers split the air, mainly Gryffindor shouts, with Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff waving small Gryffindor flags. After hours of fierce play, Gryffindor won by a narrow margin and clinched the Quidditch Cup. Professor McGonagall couldn't hide her smile. Mr. Weasley and the Gryffindor parents glowed with pride. The Slytherin parents looked pale, Lucius included. Snape's face remained mostly neutral, but he clapped in a tight, obligatory way. Sirius, unable to contain himself, leapt from the stands and barreled onto the pitch to hug his godson. "They're so happy," Luna said. Scott smiled. "Of course they are, but the House Cup is still ours, Ravenclaw's." Luna laughed. "We'll be delighted when that comes too." Then she tugged his sleeve and pointed off toward the Forbidden Forest. "Look, over there, it's flying." Scott followed her finger and saw the young Thestral trying to steady itself in clumsy flight above the tree line. "It's grown and learned to fly," Luna said, relieved. They watched a moment longer, but then the Thestral's wings stiffened. "No," Scott said, narrowing his eyes. "It can't." The creature's wings ceased entirely, and it began to plunge. "Let's go!" Luna grabbed his hand, and they sprinted down from the stands. "What happened?" Roger panted as he joined them. "That young Thestral fell during its first flight," Scott explained, and they raced toward the Forbidden Forest's edge. Roger, Milton, and Eddie followed close behind. The forest slowed their pace, but they reached the injured Thestral within 20 minutes. Scott picked it out in the grass by feel as much as sight. The creature lay still. Luna knelt beside it and began to examine the limbs. "It's got 2 broken legs," she said. Scott drew his wand. Reparo. Warm white light seeped from his tip, but it only staunched a little of the surface damage. "There's some blood, but nothing lethal," he reported. "I can stabilize it, but we need Madame Pomfrey to set the fractures properly." "Okay, stretcher," Milton said. Scott instructed them on dimensions, and they set to work cutting branches and vines with a severing charm. As they moved, Scott felt something prickling at the edge of his senses. He turned and shoved Luna out of the way, throwing himself to the ground, just as a red charm shot over their heads and struck a nearby tree with a splintering crack. "Protego!" Scott barked, and a shimmering barrier popped up in front of Roger to stop another spell. "Watch out!" he shouted. Eddie dragged Milton and Roger behind him and rolled them to cover. Scott slid to his feet cautiously, heart pounding, and spotted his attackers, 2 figures stepping out from behind a large tree. "Hey!" one of them hissed. "Not bad, little mudblood," the other taunted. Amicus and Electo Caro. They wore those smug, cruel smiles. Scott leveled his wand with steady calm. "Amicus Caro, Electo Caro," he said aloud, meeting them head-on. "I've already sensed your magic." Their smiles widened. The air smelled of malice. Scott kept his voice cool. "What do you want?" he asked. Wand pointed. "Don't forget, this is Hogwarts." "Don't forget, this is Hogwarts." As Scott spoke, his 3 roommates came to their senses and drew their wands. Luna scrambled up behind him, brushing grass from her robes with a soft, amused sound. Amicus Caro grinned, eyes full of contempt, as he stared at Scott. His sister Electo glanced at Luna with a sullen smile. "I know this is Hogwarts, you mudblood," Amicus rasped, his voice rougher than Lambeau's, "but that doesn't matter." He looked the students over. "It won't take us long to deal with you little things. A few minutes is all we need." The students' faces tightened. Roger said sharply, "Professor Dumbledore is at the stadium. He's not far. If you try anything, you won't get away." Reducto, Electo moved in an instant, shattering the shield charm in front of Roger. Roger and Eddie and Milton behind him stumbled back. Amicus Caro laughed loudly. "Hoping Dumbledore will save you?" he sneered. "Too bad he isn't at Hogwarts." Scott's voice was calm. "So that's why you dared to come here. Someone helped you lure the headmaster away." "That's right." Amicus waved his wand languidly, as if delighted to toy with them like mice. Scott watched him and said, "So the little Thestral wasn't injured by accident either." "Just a little test," Amicus admitted. "I didn't expect it would actually lure you here." He spat the slur again. "Mudblood." A dozen thoughts flashed through Scott's mind. Luring them here with the Thestral could only have come from someone who knew him and Luna well. He already had a suspect. "Stop talking," Electo snapped, impatient. "Finish him. He must pay for the death of our nephew, Elijah." Amicus gave a curt nod. Scott tightened his grip on his wand. No one saw his other hand slip into his pocket to close around the golden acorn Savannah had sealed. Before the Caros could strike, Scott triggered the charm within it. Root of the sacred tree. Thick, Living roots exploded from the ground a short distance in front of the Caro siblings with a sharp tearing sound, whipping and lashing at them. They hadn't seen the movement. Scott hadn't waved a wand. Both Amicus and Alecto screamed as the roots caught them and flung them aside. Scott felt another magical flicker, subtle and gone in an instant, but there wasn't time to investigate. "Send a signal," he said calmly. Roger snapped up his wand. A red spark shot skyward. Scott raised his own wand. "Flock of birds! Caw, caw!" Pitch-black crows poured from the tip of his wand, a rough chorus rising as the flock thickened, circling the group and blotting out the sky with black wings. Crucio, Avada Kedavra. 2 lethal spells, one red, one green, whistled from the trees. Several crows dove at them, bodies taking the hits, feathers and a few wet thumps as birds fell to the ground. "How dare they?" Milton's voice wavered. Roger steadied him. "Don't think! Fight back!" Reducto. Roger struck toward where the spells had come from. Bark splintered off a nearby oak with a dull explosion. "Attack! Don't stop!" Scott told his friends. Eddie, Milton, and Luna moved with him. Roger kept pressing the assault. The Caro siblings, for the moment, ducked back behind the trees, wary of showing themselves. Scott smiled and began to move his wand in quick, precise strokes. Crack! Crack! 2 adjacent oak trees shuddered, bark tearing as they reshaped. Branches twisted, and thick roots pulled free of the soil until 2 towering, rough humanoid figures stood where the oaks had been. Their limbs were interlocked branches, roots formed their feet. The Guardian's huge, gnarled hands slammed down in unison where the Caros had been hiding. The impact made the earth shiver. Another faint magical pulse brushed Scott's perception, subtle, hidden. If his senses hadn't been sharpened recently, he might have missed it. He watched the Caros' magical signatures shift. They'd apparated to the other side of the group. Avada Kedavra. Green light burned again. Caw! Caw! The crows threw themselves into the blast, more feathers torn away and more birds falling in the mud. Heavy footfalls boomed as the 2 Oak Guardians strode forward to shield Scott and his friends. "Go!" Alecto's voice barked from somewhere else. Amicus hesitated. "Avada Kedavra!" This time the crows managed to dodge aside. The Oak Guardian in front swung a great wooden palm, slamming into the green curse and dissipating it with a tremendous thud. The Guardian was bruised but not broken. "How is that possible?" Amicus snarled. At that instant, Scott's tension eased. "It's all right," he told his friends. "Sectum sempra." Snape's voice cut across the forest at the same time, sharp, unmistakable. At the sound, the Caro siblings apparated away without another word. "Severus," Professor Flitwick called, annoyed. A tabby cat slipped from the air and stretched into the stern shape of Professor McGonagall in front of the students, her wand already in her hand. "Are you all right? Is anyone hurt?" "We're fine, Professor," Scott answered quickly. McGonagall relaxed a fraction and glanced up at the Oak Guardians, relief breaking into a small smile. "Well done, Mr. Trollope," she said. "Exceptional transfiguration." Snape and Flitwick materialized beside her. Flitwick hurried among the students, checking them over, and could hardly hide his relief. "Thank Merlin. You're all right." "They apparated away," Snape reported. Flitwick looked displeased. "We might have caught those 2 who attacked the students," he said sharply, "if you hadn't spoken up, Severus." Snape's face was unreadable. He only shot a glance at the students and then at Scott. "It's you again, our genius Trollope," he said in his clipped tone. "You have a talent for getting into trouble that rivals Potter." He tugged a corner of his mouth into a thin smile. "Minerva, perhaps you should consider transferring these reckless Ravenclaws to Gryffindor." With that, he swept off, his black robes vanishing into the trees. Scott watched him go, then looked at McGonagall and Flitwick. Neither professor looked pleased. After a moment, McGonagall turned back to the group. "Who can tell me exactly what happened? Why did you enter the Forbidden Forest?" "I saw a thestral fall from the sky," Luna spoke up, pointing toward a small, injured thestral lying in the grass. McGonagall looked at the creature and nodded, displeasure creasing her mouth. "Next time, notify a professor immediately," she said. The students all nodded. "Sorry, Professor. It was my fault," Scott said. "They were after me, luring Professor Dumbledore away and injuring the thestral were part of a plan to get to me." Flitwick's brow furrowed. Dumbledore was invited to London by Fudge. Scott's eyebrow rose. He hadn't expected Fudge to be the lure. Fudge wasn't with the Death Eaters, and he normally wouldn't dare betray the ministry. So someone had used him. He looked at his friends. There were things he hadn't said in front of them yet. McGonagall's voice cut in. Let's go back to the castle first. Scott dismissed the Oak Guardians and the flock of crows. They sacrificed themselves to save us, Luna said quietly, then bent to gather the dead birds into her robes without hesitation. Let's help, Milton said, and soon everyone was working. Roger and Eddie dug a grave while Luna and Milton carried the fallen crows. Scott knelt, smoothing a bird's feathers before placing it into the pit. The others followed his lead. McGonagall and Flitwick watched in silence. When the grave was filled, Scott stood. They returned to the castle and took the injured Thestral to the hospital wing. Hagrid and Professor Grapeland hurried over soon after. Oh, thank you. Thank you for saving it. The poor little thing, Hagrid choked out, gratitude everywhere. Professor Grapeland wore her usual composed smile. Scott met her eyes and felt no outward deception, but he was sure she was involved. The two brief magical signatures he had sensed and lost in the forest, if he was right, had belonged to Broderick Bode, and Grapeland acted on his orders. The Carrows had likely been pawns, and the true instigator had stayed hidden, either prevented from acting further before the professors arrived or misjudging Scott's strength. After the Thestral was settled, McGonagall led Scott and his companions to her office. I've already notified Dumbledore, she said as they sat down. The headmaster emerged from the fireplace a moment later. Are the students all right? He asked. No one was hurt, McGonagall replied, looking at Scott. They sent a distress signal and held off the attackers until we arrived. Dumbledore listened as Scott recounted the whole incident. So someone else was hiding behind the Carrow siblings? He murmured, surprised. Who do you think it was, Scott? McGonagall asked. Broderick Bode, Scott said. And Stephanie Grapeland. The two professors exchanged a surprised look. Dumbledore, however, did not seem surprised. Do you have evidence for that, Scott? He asked with a faint smile. Yes, Scott said. Both are members of the Scholar Alliance. Miss Grapeland acts on Mr. Bode's orders, and it was Bode who decided to recruit me into the Alliance. Mr. Bode and Miss Grapeland. Professor McGonagall frowned as she tried to place the name. Professor Flitwick looked puzzled, too. Whoever Mr. Bode was, he clearly hadn't made much of an impression. Only Dumbledore seemed to remember at once. Broderick? Dumbledore said in surprise. Scott nodded. The last time we met him at the Ministry, he's an unspeakable from the Department of Mysteries. You were the one who told me his name. An unspeakable? At that, both McGonagall and Flitwick's faces cleared. Of course, that explains it, Flitwick added. Those unspeakables are so low-key they're almost invisible. Dumbledore, however, looked less concerned with titles than with the content of Scott's report. If you say it's him, you must have evidence. Scott knew he would have to be solid. He tapped the eagle-shaped brooch pinned to his robe and released the recording he had prepared. It contained several conversations between him and Miss Grapeland, from the night Grapeland had Caccini call him and his roommates to the classical music club activity room and every exchange after that. When the hour-long recording finished, Professor McGonagall was the first to react. Her lips were pressed tight. She fixed Scott with a severe look. What did I tell you, Mr. Trollope? She snapped. I've told you many times. If you encounter a problem, come to your professor first. Scott bowed his head, ashamed. McGonagall's anger didn't let up. But what did you do? So much happened, and you kept it hidden until today, when you and your classmates were nearly killed by 2 Death Eaters. Only then did you decide to tell us. Minerva's right, Flitwick said sternly. The danger you faced today almost cost you your lives. Did you consider the consequences? Scott's head sank lower. I'm sorry, he said earnestly. I dragged my friends into this and nearly caused them irreversible harm. The memory of the attack still hung over him. He hadn't had time to think in the moment, but afterward, a cold fear settled in his chest. If any of his 3 roommates or Luna had been injured, it would have been his fault. If someone had died because of his negligence, he couldn't bear to think how he would have lived with that guilt. That was why, in the fight, he'd been conservative, focused on keeping his friends safe, not on pursuing the enemy. He had felt immense pressure in that moment. When the professors arrived in the Forbidden Forest, He had been overcome with relief and hadn't even thought about the Caro siblings' escape. And that was why he decided, after the fact, to tell the staff. He feared that if he kept carrying this threat alone, he might endanger his friends again. McGonagall didn't relent entirely. "It's not only that you risked your friends, Mr. Trollope," she said sharply. "It's that you put yourself in danger and didn't inform us." "I'm sorry, Professor." Moved by his apology, Flitwick softened first. "I'm not blaming you, Scott," he said gently. "But I hope you remember this lesson." Scott nodded quickly. McGonagall snorted skeptically. "Phileas, we are responsible for our students' safety. Mr. Trollope needs a punishment, so he truly remembers this." Scott had no objection. Before Dumbledore could let the matter rest, McGonagall pressed the point. Dumbledore only interrupted mildly. "Scott is a smart boy. I believe he has learned his lesson," he said. Scott nodded vigorously. He had learned it. He never wanted to risk his friends again. McGonagall huffed, but did not argue further. "All right, back to the matter at hand," Dumbledore said. "Scott, why do you think Broderick Bode is B? Is it merely a coincidence of name?" "A name alone wouldn't convince me," Scott replied. "I suspected him because of the way he looked at me during that meeting. Then I investigated." He produced his magic mirror and found the clip. As the image played, the three professors leaned in, surprised. With Scott's prompting, they noticed the subtle flaw in Mr. Bode's appearance that Scott had told them about. "How did you do that?" McGonagall asked, baffled. "It's transfiguration," Scott said simply. McGonagall's confusion only deepened. "Even your transfiguration professor doesn't know how you achieved this." Scott removed a slim piece of ebony, waved his wand, and transformed it into a small surveillance lizard. The dusty little creature stopped on his palm and stared up at the professors. From the lizard's head, Scott drew a silver thread with his wand and fed it into the magic mirror. The mirror sparked, the faces of the three professors appearing in one corner as if filmed. Then the footage began to play. Professor McGonagall stared at her own image, astonishment slowly replacing confusion. "Mr. Trollope, you actually managed to do this." She ignored any question of rules and could only exclaim with delight. "You've added a rune circuit into the transformation itself. This is practically instant alchemy." She paced excitedly. "If you published a paper," she hesitated, then shook her head, thinking of Bill Weasley's similar work. "Mr. Weasley published something similar. If reviewers hadn't actually seen it, they wouldn't believe it." "Calm down, Minerva," Dumbledore said mildly. "That's not the most urgent matter right now." "It is the most important thing." McGonagall contradicted him, perhaps for the first time in front of a student. "Albus, you were a transfiguration professor once. You must understand how extraordinary this is." "Sorry, I'm late today. I only managed to update about 2,000 words. I'll try to update more tomorrow. P.S. The chapter number is wrong again. I can only fix it with the editor tomorrow."